We're gonna go back a few thousand years today, depending on what exactly you want to count as ancient. But even back then, the world was much more interconnected than you might imagine. Many of the most powerful nations had navies that ruled the seas. Warfare in the ancient world was not only done on land, but also on water, as entire fleets of warships would engage in battles with their oars locked in mortal combat until one side or the other was destroyed. Or if there wasn't a war going on, these ships were used for trade, carrying goods from nation to nation, sometimes over very great distances. And as such, there was always a high demand for people who knew how to build ships, which means there was an even higher demand for people who knew how to build the ships that could build the ships. And so it is that we find ourselves in the town of Shipwrights, where everyone works in the trade of building boats. Everyone except our hero, Finn, who has no interest at all in boats and would prefer to spend his days doing something else, like chasing girls or playing the lute or making terrible life decisions. Whatever the case, he doesn't really seem to care about anything. He doesn't even care that he's having a midlife crisis. He just sort of drifts along with whatever's happening, rarely making waves, though when he does, they tend to be pretty big waves, often causing him to get into trouble with the law. The men of Shipwrightstown are strong and burly, as anyone who makes ships for a living should be, and they resent Finn's laziness, knowing that he could do more and refuses to. One day the king calls for a meeting of all shipwrights in the realm, demanding that they come up with a way to transport a giant statue of himself that he once placed in the center of the kingdom far away across the sea in Goldenport. Now, because of their skill as shipbuilders, the king has made them nobles, meaning that the shipwrights think of themselves as equals to the king, and they're not above telling him that his idea sucks. They try to convince him that it is impossible to make a boat large enough to carry such a heavy statue, but the king isn't budging, so the shipwrights elect to send him a massive middle finger by sending nothing at all, leaving the king no choice but to call for volunteers. And as the story goes, only 2 people stepped forward, both of them young and inexperienced. Well, except for one of them, who happens to be Finn's son. See, Finn never married, but he did have a son out of wedlock who grew up in Shipwrights' town and learned the family business, mostly from watching his father avoid work. It should be noted that Finn doesn't actually hate building ships. He just hates building other people's ships. He loves building his own ships. Unfortunately, his record shows that he tends to build the fastest ships in the world, which don't really matter if they only exist for a single race. As such, he spent most of his life alone, building fast ships that he can take out on the ocean, just him and the sea, never settling down, always mobbing, never really going anywhere. Just as his father before him, he's become a drifter, spending his days lost at sea, thinking, drinking, and fishing, which is probably why he comes as such a shock to the rest of the townspeople when he announces that he intends to step up to the challenge and build the king a boat. You see, while he may not have been interested in helping others, he is interested in helping himself. He knows that if he builds this boat, not only will he win the favor of the king, but he'll finally have something to leave his father's shadow, something to call his own. Now, he knows that he needs help, and he knows that his father will never give it to him voluntarily. So he resorts to stealing. Taking what little money he has left, he heads to the local tavern and puts the proposition to any sailors willing to listen. He offers to pay them handsomely to steal the best shipbuilders in town while he goes and steals the King Essa statue. Now, getting the statue out of the city isn't too hard. All he has to do is sneak into the palace and take it through the front door, which is guarded by 2 fat, lazy guards who fall asleep the second that he bribes them. What is difficult is getting it back into the sea. There's a pretty sizable hill between the palace and the coast, and Finn isn't strong enough to push it on his own. Luckily, he had anticipated this problem and had gone ahead and hired the strongest ox in town. With the help of the ox, he gets the statue to the beach, only to realize that he forgot another very crucial thing: planks to make a boat. Again, he had anticipated this, and he'd actually gone ahead and bought every plank of wood in town, buying up every last bit of lumber at exorbitant rates. By the time he'd gotten around to using it, the price of lumber had skyrocketed, and the greedy merchants were laughing all the way to the bank. With everything in place, Finn rallies his crew of reluctant shipbuilders and gives them their orders, showing them how to use their tools, how to shape the wood, how to make the fastest boat possible. He drives them hard, though, wanting to prove himself to the king, to the town, and most of all, to his fat. They work for weeks, eating, sleeping, and drinking on the beach, refusing to leave until the ship is done. Finally, it's finished, and it's beautiful, sleek, and fast. Finn christens at the Drunken Ox and sets sail for Goldenport, taking the statue with him. He makes it most of the way there without issue, but when he arrives, the king is nowhere to be found. As it turns out, the king had grown tired of waiting for his statue and had gone ahead and hired someone else to bring it to him, a man named Unlike Finn, Erasmus was a grifter, not a shipbuilder, and so he put more thought into getting the job than doing the job. He'd taken shortcuts, cutting corners and half-assing everything. The result was a horribly ugly boat with hardly any sails, which meant that they had to rely on their oars, which was a problem because they had hardly any rowers. You see, Erasmus didn't hire a crew of experienced sailors either. Instead, he paid children to row his boat, realizing that he had been swindled. Finn challenges Erasmus to a race, offering to forfeit the statue if he wins, which Erasmus accepts. Because of his lack of planning, Erasmus's boat is slow and cumbersome, and Finn easily overtakes him, winning the race and returning the king's statue, albeit in a much worse condition than it was in when he took it. Still, the king is pleased, awarding Finn with half of the reward that he promised Erasmus, making him rich beyond his wildest dreams. The Shipwrights of Shipwrights Town are also pleased, recognizing Finn's skill and welcoming him back into the community. And though Finn still spends a lot of time out at sea, he's not as lonely as he once was, now having the respect of his peers and the admiration of his son. Now, if you're enjoying this series and you want to support us in making more videos, please consider supporting us on Patreon. If you want to watch more of our stuff, you can do that here. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and have yourselves a great day. Hohoy there, mateys. In our last episode, we talked about how humans first took to the seas in all their glory. But the question remains, how did they get there? How did we invent the ship? What was it like back before the days of sail and steam? What were those very first vessels that braved the mighty waves? And most importantly, why should you keep watching this channel? Because we're going to find out together right now. Chapter Does. The origins of shipbuilding. Let's begin with the basics. When our hominid ancestors first started venturing out into the water, they didn't exactly have access to power tools and steel goods, so the early ships were mostly made from whatever materials were at hand, primarily wood and animal hides. The earliest known example of a watercraft is the raft, and we know from experience that these things aren't too hard to make. All you need are some logs and some rope, and maybe even some vines or animal tendons for extra support. Securely lash those logs together and then put some sort of shelter in the middle, be it just a thatched hut or something a little bit more sophisticated depending on your level of technology. These rafts would have been stable but slow and really only useful for shorter journeys. But given the fact that not all rivers run smooth, this probably wasn't much of an issue. Rivers can be dangerous, even deadly. In many cases, however, a raft was preferable to attempting to cross on foot. Also, if you weren't traveling in a group large enough to justify building a boat, a raft could be a good alternative to swimming. And what's more, while a raft might not be very good for long-distance travel, it's great for fishing. The ability to set up nets or cast a line from a raft would have provided early humans with a new way to hunt and therefore survive. The next big step came when humans discovered something called the dugout canoe. Now, this style of boat still exists today in many parts of the world, and the idea is pretty straightforward. Take a large tree, cut it down and hollow it out. This would have required a sharp stone axe, meaning that the people who invented the dugout canoe had advanced beyond the use of the simple hand axe, which came into use around 2 million years ago during the Stone Age. We don't know the exact date when the dugout canoe was invented. It could have been as early as 8000 BCE. But the oldest confirmed evidence we have so far comes from the Deswegen River in Germany, where archaeologists discovered the remains of a dugout canoe that dates back to around 4000 BC. This vessel was approximately 32 feet long and 15 inches wide. Researchers also found traces of pitch, which they believe may have been used to waterproof the canoe, as well as traces of copper nails, which suggested that the makers of this vessel may have been experimenting with metal. The dugout canoe was a huge improvement over the raft. It was faster, easier to maneuver, and could carry a heavier load. But the biggest advantage it offered was stability. Being enclosed on all sides meant that it was much harder to tip over. As a result, this type of vessel was ideal for open water. It is believed that many ancient cultures independently came up with the idea of the dugout canoe, and indeed this method of shipbuilding is still used in some remote areas even today. For instance, on the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea, the local people build canoes the same way as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. But not all early ships were made of wood. Some civilizations opted for lighter materials such as reeds. The oldest confirmed example of a reed boat was discovered in a Neolithic burial site in the Chinese province of Gansu. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a 43-foot-long vessel which appears to have been constructed by weaving reeds together. It's important to note that while the Egyptians often built red boats, they also used wood for larger seafaring ships. However, one of the largest and most impressive examples of a purely red boat was discovered in Egypt itself, near the city of Alexandria. This vessel, known as the Abu Qir ship, dates back to around 3100 BCE, making it possibly the oldest known seaworthy boat ever found. It was about 75 feet long and 18 feet wide. Researchers believe it could have carried up to 80 people or 200 tons of cargo across the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient Mesopotamia was also a hotbed for early shipbuilding innovation. There is archaeological evidence that as early as 1800 BCE, the Sumerians were constructing ships out of cedar wood. One of the most famous examples of Mesopotamian shipbuilding is the Standard of Ur. This is a 2,600-year-old artifact depicting various aspects of life in ancient Mesopotamia, including a large ship sailing on the Persian Gulf. Interestingly, the ship shown on the standard doesn't look much like the ships we think of today. Instead of having a single deck, it appears to have multiple decks on top of each other. While this may seem strange to us, this type of multi-deck ship was actually quite common in ancient times. For example, the ancient Greeks also built ships with multiple decks. They called them polychrones, and they used them for both war and trade. Speaking of the Greeks, let's talk about the Phoenicians. These guys are widely credited with developing the first true seafaring ships, the kind that could actually be steered and therefore travel long distances over open water. Prior to the Phoenicians, most ships were just kind of floating platforms that went wherever the wind and current took them. They were basically just good for traveling along rivers or in calm waters. It wasn't until the Phoenicians came along that humans learned how to take full advantage of the ocean. The Phoenicians were a maritime trading nation. They lived on the eastern Mediterranean coast, and their empire stretched from modern-day Lebanon to Spain. They were master navigators and traders, and they were responsible for spreading many new ideas and goods throughout the Mediterranean. Many historians believe that the Phoenicians were the first people to invent the alphabet. They also developed many new technologies related to ships. They were the first ones to invent the keel, which is a structural element that runs along the bottom of a ship and provides stability. They also developed new ways of fastening the planks of a ship together, which made them stronger and more seaworthy. And of course they created the first triangular sail, which allowed ships to sail into the wind. Thanks to the Phoenicians, humans finally learned how to harness the power of the ocean and sail across the seas. They opened up new trade routes and made it possible for people to explore and conquer new lands. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Deep Dive. Do you have any suggestions for topics we should cover in future episodes? If so, leave them in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an upload. Until then, see you on the high seas, ARG. All jokes aside though, the ancient Egyptians are generally considered to be among the first people to invent the compass, which was an essential tool for navigation. They also developed new shipbuilding techniques that allowed them to build larger and more powerful ships. For example, they were the first ones to develop the technique of overlaying planks on top of the frame of a ship, which made the ship stronger and more watertight. These innovations allowed Egyptian ships to travel farther and carry more goods than any other ships before them. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egypt had become a major maritime power. Egyptian ships were used for a variety of purposes, including trade, exploration, and warfare. They traded with other Mediterranean civilizations, such as the Canaanites, the Assyrians, and the Greeks. Egyptian ships were also used to explore new lands. For example, in 450 BCE, the Egyptian admiral Necho sent a fleet of ships to circumnavigate Africa. And finally, Egyptian ships were also used for warfare. The Egyptian navy was a formidable force to be reckoned with, and played an important role in defending Egypt's interests. One of the most famous examples of an ancient Egyptian ship is the solar boat of Chephren. This is a large ceremonial boat that was built for the funeral of the Egyptian pharaoh Shep. It was discovered in the Giza Pyramid complex and is believed to have been used to transport the pharaoh's body to the afterlife. The solar boat is a masterpiece of ancient Egyptian engineering. It's made of cedar wood and is decorated with intricate carvings and paintings. It was originally 185 feet long, but has since been broken into pieces. Despite its age, the solar boat is still in remarkably good condition and is a testament to the skill and craftsmanship of the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians were also among the first people to develop shipbuilding yards. These were specialized facilities where ships could be built quickly and efficiently. The Egyptians had several shipbuilding yards along the Nile River, as well as on the coast of the Mediterranean. These yards were staffed by skilled workers who were trained in the art of shipbuilding. They used advanced tools and techniques to build ships that were strong, fast, and seaworthy. The Egyptian shipbuilding industry played an important role in the economy of the ancient world. The ships that were built in Egypt were used for trade, exploration, and warfare, which brought wealth and power to the Egyptian civilization. The shipbuilding industry also provided jobs and economic opportunities for many people. In conclusion, the ancient Egyptians were pioneers of shipbuilding. They developed many innovations that allowed them to build larger, more powerful ships that could travel farther and carry more cargo than any other ships before them. Their ships were used for trade, exploration, and warfare, and played an important role in the economy of the ancient world. The Egyptians were also among the first people to develop shipbuilding yards, which allowed them to build ships quickly and efficiently. The legacy of the ancient Egyptians lives on today in the form of modern ships. Many of the techniques and principles that they developed are still used today to build ships that are bigger, faster, and more powerful than ever before. Now, check out more of our videos here on this channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Until then, see you on the next one. And this is Chapter 3, Tools of the Trade. The tools that we use for sculpting are pretty simple. We have our primitive axes, we have chisels, we have adze's, we have saws, and we also have some bronze tools, iron tools, some old hand tools, and of course, these are the tools that are kind of available to us from the time period, but obviously, they're not just dropped out of the sky. These tools would have been traded into the area, because back then, technology wasn't really shared between societies, unless there was trade or war. So all of these tools that we have here are pretty much from about 2,500 years ago. So this is an axe. It's called a pickaxe. It's used for chopping, splitting rocks. So it's a tool that would have been used by builders. I mean, look at this. It's super sharp. It would have been very, very dangerous working with something like that. You can still see the original handle right here. This is wood, of course. It's not the original head. This is a replacement handle. And if you look at how it goes in, it actually fits really well. There's no way to attach this to the head other than to wedge it in there. There would have been no glue used. There would have been no metal pins. They would have just driven the handle into the head until it fit. And so this one probably did get replaced many times throughout its lifetime. We also have another axe head. Now, this one is slightly different. Look at this edge right here. This is super sharp. This is what we call a flat bit. So when you hit it, it's going to be going straight down. So this is good for chopping wood, but it's also good for cutting stone. So this could be used for roughing out stone. You wouldn't really carve with this, but you could use it to cut into the stone and make your first cuts. That's why it's so important to have a variety of tools. Now, this is a drill. It's a bow and drill. So we have a wooden stick here, and then we have a drill bit here. And this drill bit would have been attached to a rope, and then you would have pulled it tight, and then you would use the bow to drill the hole. So you would just turn the drill bit while you pull it tight with the rope, and it gone knock. Create a hole in the stone. Obviously, this is a lot harder than it looks, and it's also a lot slower. This one is made of bronze. They would have also used a lot of stone drills. In fact, they probably started with a stone drill before they had bronze tools. And so, these are just pieces of harder stones. They would have gotten a hard piece of rock, and then they would have chipped it down with their hardest rock. They would have chipped off flakes until they got the shape that they wanted. And so these would have been used in the same way as these. You would tie a rope to it. You would pull it tight, and then you would use the bow to twist the drill bit as it went into the stone. This is a chisel, and this has a very, very finely honed edge. Chisels are used for chipping away small bits of stone. So, if you were carving a face for example, and you were trying to get those little grooves and things, this is what you would use. Obviously, this takes an incredible amount of patience and skill. And it's also a lot harder than it looks. It looks easy to make a nice smooth edge like this. It takes a lot of work. These chisels would have been made from either bronze or iron. In fact, back then, bronze was probably more common than iron. Iron was getting more common towards the end of the Bronze Age. But obviously, bronze tools are a lot softer and they would have dulled a lot quicker. They would have needed to be replaced a lot more often. Iron was stronger and tougher, so it would have lasted longer. So they would have tried to save their bronze tools and use them on the easier jobs, and then use their iron tools on the harder jobs. This is a type of chisel that's called a thumbnail. It's used for making the finer details. This one happens to be bone. It could also be made from bronze or iron. And so if you look at the edge right here, it's a lot thinner than the chisel. If you remember the chisel we saw earlier, it was pretty thick, but it had a really sharp edge. On this one, it's a lot thinner, so it's going to make a lot finer lines. This would be used for fine detail work, maybe carving faces, things like that. This is a mallet. It's made of wood, obviously. It would have been used for hitting other tools, probably hitting a chisel. This is called a dead blow. It's basically a mallet that's filled with lead shot. So this would have been used on chisels. And this is a very specialized tool. These were probably pretty rare. Most likely they would have just used regular wooden mallets, and so this would have been a tool that was brought into this culture. Maybe a culture further north where they were doing more metalworking would have made this. This is a great example of a tool that wouldn't have been made here. They wouldn't have had the technology. They wouldn't have had the resources to make this. And so this is a perfect example of trade. Someone traded this into this society. Jesus and all. It's a pointed tool that would have been used for drilling holes. Back then, they wouldn't have used nails. Instead, they would have used wooden pegs. So if they were building something, maybe they were putting a shelter together or something like that, they would have put two pieces of wood together and then they would have drilled a hole through it. And then they would take a peg and they would drive it through. So this would have been used for putting things together. This is one of the most basic tools, but it's also one of the most useful. These are saws. They're bronze saws. They're really cool. They're hand saws. Basically, you just saw back and forth. They're similar to modern-day saws. These are pretty rare. We don't find a lot of these. So if you had to cut wood, you would have used a saw like this. And again, you would have to have traded for this. These were probably brought in from somewhere else. Maybe people who lived along the coast would have had access to better tools like this because they would have been trading with other cultures. They would have been more exposed to other cultures than people who lived inland would have been. So this is a potsherd. It's a broken piece of pottery, and this has a design that dates it. This was made around 800 BC, so this would have been right at the end of the Bronze Age. And this has designs of people holding hands. It's got these two figures, and it's got this rope pattern. This might have come from Greece. People would have been trading pottery like this all over the place, and so even though this isn't technically a tool, it is a trade item. And so it tells us about the people who lived here, the culture that lived here, and the people that they were trading with. The tools of the trade are incredibly important to understanding any civilization. I mean, the tools that people use tell us how they worked, tell us how they lived. They tell us what their lifestyle was like. Just think about the amount of time and effort it took to make these tools. You know, these weren't just made overnight. Making a tool like this must have taken a lot of time. And then think about how much time it took to sharpen these tools. I mean, sharpening a chisel is hard enough today with electric sharpeners, but back then they would have used stones to sharpen their tools. And so just think about how much time it took. I mean, you couldn't build anything without tools. These tools are what allowed people to build the things that they built. These tools are what allowed people to survive back then. So the tools of the trade are a really important part of understanding ancient civilizations. And so now we've finished talking about the tools that they use. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about their religion, their beliefs, their worldview, and we'll see you then. This is an axe. This is not an axe, and this is definitely not an axe. These are all stone tools from the Stone Age. Humans have been using stone tools for about 2.6 million years, and at one point, these would have been the best tools available to humans. But even with these tools, cutting down large trees would have been an incredible task. How did ancient humans accomplish this? What was life like in the Stone Age? And how do we get that wood to our camp? Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm your host. Today we're going to pretend that we are living in the Stone Age, and we're going to cut down some trees. If you've been watching the series, we're in the process of building a home out of natural materials, and today we're going to start working on the timber. Now, when people think of the Stone Age, they think of primitive people using crude stone tools to hack away at things. That is certainly true, but there were also people who used incredibly sophisticated tools made out of bone, antler, and wood. So today, we're going to try and harvest some timber using Stone Age tools. We'll use axes made of rock and antler, but we're not going to use sharp metal axes or chainsaws. This should be pretty fun. We have a huge forest behind our homestead, so we're lucky if we need to cut down some trees. There are a couple small creeks nearby that we can use to float logs down to our camp, but we don't have any boats, so that could make getting the trees to camp difficult. Luckily, we're only about 100 yards from our homestead, so it shouldn't be too bad. In prehistoric times, early humans had access to tools, such as hand axes and cleavers. These tools were very useful for cutting, chopping, and carving wood. Early humans also developed more sophisticated tools, such as the saw. A saw is basically two pieces of sharpened stone lashed together with sinew. In between them is a flat piece of either wood or bone. When the user pulls the saw towards them, the bottom piece of wood scrapes against the top piece of wood, which acts as a file. As the saw is pulled, it cuts into the wood like a very rough rasp. It takes a lot of effort to cut down a tree with a saw, so early humans probably worked in groups when doing dangerous tasks, such as cutting down trees. Some trees are sacred. Grove areas where these sacred trees grow are called heleg. Some people believe that if you cut down a tree in a sacred grove, then the spirits of the woods will punish you. To avoid being punished, some people perform rituals before cutting down a tree. Sometimes these rituals involve making an offering to the tree or to the spirits of the forest before taking down the tree. Many tribes around the world have their own unique ways of interacting with the spirits of the forest. Some people believe that if you treat the forest with respect, then it will provide for you. Others believe that the forest has a spirit of its own and that this spirit can be dangerous if angered. Today, I've chosen a tree that isn't too big and should come down fairly easily. We'll be taking down a hickory tree that is about 18 inches in diameter. Before I attempt to cut down the hickory tree, I must first make sure that I am safe. I have my trusty sidekick with me. He's here to help me cut down the tree and make sure I don't get hurt. I've chosen a spot where the tree will fall away from the house and other trees. Once I am satisfied that the area is clear, I begin to cut down the hickory tree. I start by cutting grooves into the tree. The grooves are about 2 inches apart and go about 1 inch deep. I am careful not to cut too deep and hit the axe. After I've cut several grooves around the tree, I start to cut a notch in the side of the tree. The notch is about 18 inches high and 6 inches deep. I am almost done cutting the notch when I hear a loud crack. I stop what I'm doing and look around. I see that a large branch has fallen off the tree and is heading straight for me. I quickly move out of the way, and the branch misses me by only a few feet. I take a moment to catch my breath, and then continue cutting the notch. It takes me several hours to cut down the hickory tree. By the time I am finished, I am exhausted, but I am also very happy. I have just cut down my first tree using nothing but a stone axe. Getting the log out of the woods is just as hard as cutting the tree down. We tried rolling the log out of the woods, but it was too difficult. So we decided to try dragging it out. We used a rope made of hickory bark to drag the log. It took us several hours to drag the log to our homestead. Once the log is at the homestead, I can finally start to process it. I start by splitting the log into smaller pieces. It takes me several hours to split the log into planks. Once I have the planks, I start to shape them using a variety of tools. I use a stone axe to shape the planks and a saw to make them more precise. It takes me several days to finish all the planks, but once I am finished, I am very proud of my work. I have taken a log from the forest and turned it into usable lumber. Getting a tree down is a very dangerous job. Accidents happen every year, and many people are injured or killed while working in the logging industry. Logging is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Even with modern equipment, logging is a risky business. One wrong move and a logger can be crushed or cut to pieces by a falling tree. There are many different ways to fell a tree. The method a logger uses depends on the size and location of the tree. But no matter what method a logger uses, safety is always the top priority. Felling a tree is a very technical process. It requires skill, precision, and experience. A well-executed felling is a thing of beauty. There's something about the controlled power of it all that's just really satisfying to watch. But it's also a dangerous job, and if you're not careful, it can end in disaster. Felling a tree is more than just chopping it down. It's an art form. It takes skill and experience to do it properly. But anyone can swing an axe. It takes a special kind of person to fell a tree safely and efficiently. That's why loggers are so highly trained. They know how to assess the risks and take the necessary precautions. They also know how to execute a perfect felling. There are many ways to fell a tree, but the most common way is to cut down the tree's trunk. The idea is to make a cut on one side of the trunk, then make a cut on the opposite side. The two cuts will eventually encircle the trunk, and the tree will fall. This method is simple but dangerous. One wrong move and the logger could be crushed or cut to pieces by a falling tree. Another method of felling a tree is to cut down the tree's branches. This method is more difficult because it requires the logger to work at different heights, but it is also less dangerous. The idea is to cut down the outer branches first, then work inwards. Once the outer branches are down, the logger can cut down the inner branches and the tree will fall. A third method of felling a tree is to use a climbing spike. This method is the most dangerous, but it is also the most efficient. The idea is for the logger to climb up the tree and then cut down the trunk from the top. This method is risky, but it is effective. No matter what method a logger uses, safety is always the top priority. Before a logger even starts cutting, he or she will assess the situation and develop a plan. The logger will consider the tree's location, size, and condition, and will develop a strategy for felling the tree safely. Once the plan is in place, the logger will take the necessary precautions. This may include setting up safety lines or erecting warning signs. Once everything is in order, the logger can begin cutting. But even then, the logger must remain aware of his or her surroundings at all times. A falling tree can cause serious injury or death, so a logger must be prepared for anything. When the tree is finally down, the loggers will take a moment to assess the damage. They will check for any hazards and make sure the area is safe. Then they can celebrate their hard work. Felling a tree is a dangerous job, but it's also a rewarding one. When done correctly, it's a thing of beauty. There's something about the controlled power of it all that's just really satisfying to watch. It takes skill and experience to do it properly, but anyone can swing an axe. It takes a special kind of person to fell a tree safely and efficiently. That's why loggers are so highly trained. They know how to assess the risks and take the necessary precautions. They also know how to execute a perfect felling. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos. We'll see you next time. This is the 5th chapter from my new book, Tales of the Riverman, about building a wooden boat with green wood. If you want to hear more stories like this one, get the book or sign up for the audio. Chapter 5. The backbreaking work of shaping wood. I spent 2 weeks preparing the live edge planks for bending. I'd cut down trees, stripped off the branches, and left them in a big pile under a tarp. It was too wet to work in the river, so I figured I would start shaping planks. There are 3 steps to getting wood ready to bend over the frame. First is seasoning. This is where you let the wood dry out a bit, so it's not so green. Second is bending. You take your seasoned planks and bend them over a fire or steam. Finally, you have fitting. This is where you smooth out the joints until there is no gap between planks when the ship is put together. The first step, seasoning, is not really necessary, but it makes the next step easier. Planks that are too wet can be difficult to bend, so I just let mine sit out in the weather for a couple weeks. Then I pulled them out from under the tarp and started stacking them in our workshop. The second step is bending. We built a big fire pit behind the house and then laid planks on stones beside it. Now all we have to do is wait for the wood to steam. As the fire burns, the steam will soak into the wood and warm it up. After about an hour, I took a plank off the fire and tried bending it around a knee-high piece of pipe. It bent easily, so I figured the wood was ready. I had never bent live edge wood before, and I was pretty nervous. I put a plank on the fire and waited another hour. then took it off and bent it over the form. I held my breath as I bent it, and it cracked. Guess it wasn't ready. I went ahead and put it back on the fire for another hour and tried again. This time it bent without racking. That's how I knew the wood was finally ready to go. I went through each plank, bending them around the form until they were all shaped. Bending is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and attention, but as satisfying as it is to watch, it's nothing compared to the fitting. That's because fitting is kind of like fitting a puzzle together. You have to make sure every plank fits perfectly around the other ones, so that there are no gaps when the ship is finally put together. And even a small mistake here can mean a leaky boat at sea. This is why boat builders used to spend months fitting planks. It's such hard work. You need to sand and fit the planks until you have perfect joints. As I started to shape planks, I quickly realized that I had made a huge mistake. I had thought that fitting would be easy, so I hadn't ordered any sandpaper. I was in desperate need of some sandpaper, but I didn't have any way of getting it. The nearest store was miles away across the river, so I was forced to do something unthinkable. I had to go across the frozen river in the canoe. Fortunately, the ice was thin enough that the canoe could still float, so I paddled across to the store and bought 30 sheets of sandpaper. Then I headed home, excited to finish shaping planks. I sanded the edges of the planks until they were smooth. I was trying to hurry things along, but this was tedious and time-consuming. Every plank has several joints that must be fitted together perfectly. The more joints, the more work. I stopped every so often to try putting the planks together, like a kid playing with Legos. I love putting things together, but I was frustrated because everything was too loose. I had to keep sanding. Finally, after days of sanding, I could start gluing. It took me a week to fit all the joints. By the end of the week, I had finished the last joint. The very last thing I had to do was clean up the inside of the boat. I grabbed my scraper and went to work. I scraped until I had removed all the sawdust and shavings. Then I went back over the entire boat, making sure every joint was tight. I couldn't believe it was finally done. But now came the scary part: caulking. Caulking is the process of putting oakum in the seams of the boat. Oakum is a type of thick rope that is tarred. This is the process of sticking oakum in all the cracks of the boat. In between each plank, there is a small crack. These cracks need to be filled with oakum so water does not leak in. Water tightness is very important for boats. If the boat leaks, it may sink. Now that the shell was complete, I started finishing the interior. I started by cutting down some dead trees that had fallen into the river. With these, I built a temporary stove inside the boat. This would allow me to heat pitch to the right temperature. Pitch is sticky, gooey stuff that we will use to waterproof the boat. First, I cut the trees into smaller pieces. I brought these pieces to the fire and burned them. The next day, I gathered the ashes and threw them into the river. Then I started cutting down some young green trees. These would be used as stakes for the oven. Next, I dug a trench all the way around the perimeter of the boat. This would help contain the heat and smoke from the oven. Now I placed the stakes in the ground and set up the oven. I'm going to use this oven to bake pitch, which is very similar to tar. Pitch is a natural material that comes from pine trees. It's very sticky and gooey, but when it's heated up, it becomes liquid. Pitch can be used to waterproof the seams in wooden boats. To make pitch, you take pine logs and burn them slowly. The pitch that oozes out of the logs needs to be caught before it hardens. I built a trough beside the fire pit to collect the pitch as it dripped out of the logs. This pitch will be used to coat the oakum and make it waterproof. I have to heat up the pitch by throwing in small sticks. This keeps the pitch liquid. I built a shelf inside the boat to hold the pitch pot. I hung the pot over the fire. The goal is to heat the pitch to the perfect temperature. This is hot enough to melt the pitch, but not hot enough to burn it. This is very hard to judge. Every few minutes, I grab a dipper and dunk it into the pot. Then I pull it out and look to see if any pitch is dripping off the dipper. If it is, then the pitch is ready. I toss handfuls of oakum into the pitch until it's all coated. Then I take the coated oakum and stuff it into the seams of the boat. I struggled to reach the pitch pot through the narrow opening. I managed to get it out and hung another one up. I repeated the process, heating up the pitch and coating the oakum. I continued this process until all the seams were filled with oakum. The seams are very tight, so it took quite a bit of force to push the oakum in. At times I could feel myself getting frustrated. I would stop Take a deep breath and calm down. I repeated this process until every seam was full of oakum. Finally, I had finished caulking. This was the last major step before launching the boat. Now that the boat was waterproofed, I could start working on the trim. The first thing I did was install the shear clamps. These are pieces of wood that run along the top edge of the boat. They help hold the shape of the boat. Then I installed the gunnels. These are the long pieces of wood that run along the sides of the boat. Finally, I installed the thwarts. Thwarts are pieces of wood that run across the boat. They help support the deck. With the trim pieces in place, I started working on the decks. Decks are the pieces of wood that form the floor of the boat. I cut down trees and shaped them into decks. Then I started putting the decks into place. This was hard work. The decks were heavy and awkward to maneuver. I finished installing the last deck and started working on the hatch. A hatch is a hole in the deck that allows people to get into the boat. I cut out the hatch opening, then framed it with wood. The final step was to install the hatch lid. I had built the hatch lid weeks ago. Now I carefully maneuvered it into place and secured it with hooks. I stood back and admired my work. The boat looked beautiful. I was exhausted and sore, but I couldn't wait to get into the river. I waded into the shallow water and pushed the boat off. It floated. We all cheered and clapped. Then we started loading supplies into the boat. Soon, we were ready to set sail. We shoved off from the bank and started downriver. The current was strong, so we didn't have to paddle very hard. I sat in the bow, keeping an eye out for rocks and logs. We rounded a bend and saw a sandbar directly in our path. We all began paddling furiously, but it was too late. The boat ran aground. I jumped out and waded to shore. The others stayed in the boat while I tried to dislodge the boat. The boat was stuck fast. There was nothing I could do. I jumped back into the boat and we started pulling on vines and branches. Finally, we managed to free the boat and we were on our way again. I paddled alongside the boat, keeping an eye out for dangers. We rounded a bend and spotted a sandbar up ahead. I shouted a warning, but it was too late. The boat ran aground again. I jumped out and waded to shore. The others stayed in the boat while I tried to dislodge the boat. Once again, the boat was stuck fast. I jumped back into the boat and we started paddling again. Soon we reached a wide spot in the river. Here the current was faster and the water was deeper. We picked up the pace and paddled hard. Before long, we saw a camp in the distance. We paddled toward it, eager to reach our destination. But as we approached, we saw a sandbar directly in our path. We all began paddling frantically, but it was no use. The boat ran aground yet again. I jumped out and waded to shore. The others stayed in the boat while I tried to dislodge the boat. Once again, the boat was stuck fast. I jumped back into the boat and we started paddling again. Before long, we saw our camp in the distance. We paddled toward it, eager to reach our destination. But as we approached, we saw a sandbar directly in our path. We all began paddling frantically, but it was no use. The boat ran aground yet again. I jumped out and waded to shore. The others stayed in the boat while I tried to dislodge the boat. Once again, the boat was stuck fast. I jumped back into the boat and we started paddling again. As we turned the final bend in the river, we saw our camp in the distance. We paddled toward it, eager to reach our destination. But as we approached, we saw a sandbar directly in our path. We all began paddling frantically, but it was no use. The boat ran aground yet again. I jumped out and waded to shore. The others stayed in the boat while I tried to dislodge the boat. Once again, the boat was stuck fast. I jumped back into the boat and we started paddling again. And that's the end of Chapter 5. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time. It's time for Chapter 6, Daily Life in the Shipyard. And don't forget, if you enjoy these stories, please leave a thumbs up, subscribe to be notified when the next story is released. You can also support me through donations. The sun was barely visible behind the clouds, but it was light enough for the shipyard workers to begin their day. A group of men shuffled out of the tavern, wiping sleep from their eyes and shaking off the remnants of dreams. They had slept poorly, fitfully, with nightmares of being trapped beneath the sea or of running aground on a sandbar. For many of them, the work they did every day was dangerous, hard and dirty. Yet they were skilled craftsmen, highly sought after throughout the world. For these men were shipwrights, builders of fine vessels that would cross the seas. They walked across the muddy ground towards their worksite where several ships were being built. Some of them were large, like the one Jeremiah and his brother Elias were working on. It was meant to be a merchant vessel, intended to transport cargo between the major cities. Other ships being built were smaller, like those built by Finn and Dan. These were fishing vessels, smaller than the average merchant ship, but still big enough to hold many men and their gear. The little ships were built quickly, usually within a few months, while the larger ones took almost a year to finish. Jeremiah adjusted the hammer that hung at his belt and stretched his aching arms. He looked up at the sky. The full moon had risen the previous night and would set in a few hours. The early morning air was cool against his warm skin. Soon the sun would rise and the temperature would soar to the point where they would be drenched in sweat. Jeremiah liked this time of day best. The few hours before the sun reached its zenith, he joined his brother and the other shipwrights who had already begun their work. As he grabbed an axe, he called out to the others, "A hearty good morning to you all. Did any of you have any luck at the tavern last night? Any wenches or ale?" Some of the men laughed, but most only shook their heads. They had gambled away their last coins the evening before and now were paying the price. After the laughter died down, they fell silent as they began their work. Songs and chants were sometimes heard in the shipyard, but mostly there was only silence. If a man needed to talk to another, he would call out above the ringing of hammers and the buzz of saws. Each ship was made up of dozens of parts, each one requiring different tools and skills to construct. There were planks to shape, masts to raise, ropes to coil, and so much more. Men worked together, not only because they couldn't do it alone, but because the task would take too long if they didn't. Usually, two men would work on the same part of a ship, one shaping the wood with an axe or saw, and the other smoothing the edges with a file or mallet. Others used long hooks to lift heavy planks into place, and then secured them with wooden pegs. The men worked long hours from the time the first light appeared in the sky until dusk. If they worked well, they could complete a small ship in just a few months, but building a large one took a full year and sometimes longer. To speed up the process, they worked 7 days a week, rarely taking a break except for eating. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men's shirts became soaked with sweat. They wiped their brows and necks with scraps of cloth, then continued their work. Every now and then, one of the men would pause and wipe his brow with a scrap of cloth, then continue his work. Their faces and arms were scratched and blistered from the work. Splinters were driven under their fingernails, which became infected and bled. Their muscles ached, and their backs were bent from lifting heavy timbers. But these men did not complain. They were proud of what they did. When a storm struck and threatened to destroy their work, they cursed the wind and rain and fought to protect their ships. When rival shipwrights tried to sabotage their work, they would catch them and punish them. If a ship sank after being launched, they searched the water for survivors and salvaged what they could. These men were brothers. They lived, ate, and slept together. They shared their food and their drinks and their women. They were like family. As the weeks went by, Jeremiah watched the ship grow. First, it was just a pile of wood. Then it began to take shape. Now, it looked like a real ship, but it wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. They had to finish the interior, add the sails and rigging, mount the cannons, and so much more. One day, a heavy rainstorm struck. The men cursed and ran for cover. They stood under the trees, watching the rain pour down and soaking their clothes. Then lightning flashed across the sky and thunder roared. The men screamed and laughed. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck one of the ships and set it on fire. The men ran for their tools and tried to beat out the flames, but it was no use. The entire ship was destroyed. The men watched in horror as their work burned to the ground. When the fire was finally put out, they stood among the ashes and debris. They felt like they had lost a friend. They had worked so hard to build this ship, and now it was gone. But they were not daunted. They had lost one ship, but they still had plenty of time to build more. As the rain began to let up, the men returned to their work. They started over, cutting down new trees and hauling them to the shipyard. They worked quickly, knowing that they had to make up for lost time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The men worked tirelessly, eating, sleeping, and dreaming of ships. Finally, the day came when the ship was completed. It was a beautiful vessel, strong and sturdy, with sails that looked like white wings. The men stood back and admired their work. They had done it. They had built a ship that would sail the seas and carry valuable cargo to far-off lands. They celebrated with a feast, eating roasted pig and drinking spiced wine. They sang and danced around a bonfire, celebrating their victory over the elements and their triumph over adversity. In the end, they knew that they had created something special, a ship that would become a legend. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the shipyard, the men prepared to launch the ship. This was always the most dangerous part of the process, for a ship was a lot of work to sink. The men had put their heart and soul into this one, and they were unable to let it go to waste. They had planned for this moment carefully, making sure everything was in place. The ship was greased and ready to slide into the water. The men lined up along the ways, each one holding onto a rope that was tied to the mast. With a final shout, they let go and the ship began to move. It glided down the ways and into the water with surprising ease. For a moment, everyone just stared at the ship as it floated on the surface of the water. Then cheers erupted and the men began to celebrate. They had done it. They had built a ship that would cross the seas. As the celebration continued late into the night, the men knew that they had accomplished something special. They had built a ship that would become a legend. The next morning, the men awoke to the sound of hammering and sawing. It was time to start on their next project. They had built a ship that would cross the seas, but that was nothing compared to the ships they dreamed of building in the future. They would build ships that would carry people to new lands, ships that would fight in great battles, and ships that would change the world. The men knew that they had a long way to go, but they were excited to get started. They had built one ship together, but they knew that they could build more. They were shipwrights, builders of fine vessels that would cross the seas, and they were just getting started. So ends chapter 6, Life in the Shipyard. What did you think of the story? Let me know in the comments. Please remember to leave a thumbs up, subscribe to be notified when the next story is released. You can also support me through donations. Thanks for watching. This is the School of Hard Knocks. Today we are going to look at chapter 7 of Miyamoto Musashi's book of 5 Rings. If you want to check out a reading of the entire book, I highly recommend the translation by Victor Harris. The link is provided below if you'd like to pick up a copy. Musashi wrote this book in the early 1600s in Japan. This is the first book ever written about strategy and tactics for sword fighting. It is still studied today by martial artists all over the world. Chapter 7. The role of apprentices under a master swordsman. Young boys learn to polish armor, prepare weapons, and practice their footwork. They also observe how other students practice with wooden swords and assist when they can. In Tosei days, it was common for a student to be the apprentice of a dojo for several years, before being allowed to touch a real sword. In the beginning, the young students don't get to do much. They spend their time polishing armor, sharpening swords, and cleaning the dojo. When I did judo, we had to clean the dojo before and after every practice. We would sweep the floor, line up the mats, and put away the equipment. Cleaning the dojo taught me respect and discipline. It gave me a sense of pride knowing that I played a part in keeping our training area neat and orderly. One of the most important lessons that any swordsman learns is humility. A swordsman must be humble, not only before God but before his teacher, his friends, and his seniors. One way that Musashi teaches this lesson is by having the youngest members of the dojo perform menial tasks. By doing so, the younger swordsmen understand their place in the group. They know that they have much to learn from their teachers and their peers. They are reminded that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and that no one should be looked down upon. As an apprentice, you will have to do some very grueling exercises. These exercises are designed to test your patience, endurance, and mental fortitude. You will have to repeat the same task over and over again until it becomes second nature. You will have to push through pain and exhaustion until your body and mind are one. Don't complain or make excuses. Embrace the challenge and use it to make yourself better. Remember, every great swordsman started out as a lowly apprentice. Every master was once a student who had to learn the basics. Do not be afraid to start at the bottom and work your way up. There is much to observe in the way of footwork, swordplay, and overall strategy. This is the best way to increase your skills without actually engaging in combat. Of course, you'll have to spar eventually, but as an apprentice, your main job is to absorb as much knowledge as possible. Study the masters and try to emulate their every move. Pay attention to their footwork, their body language, and their swordsmanship. Try to understand why they do what they do and how they do it. The more you observe, the more you will learn. The more you learn, the better you will become. One of the most important things to remember is that everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Everyone has different skills and abilities. As an apprentice, you may feel like you are not as good as the other students. You may feel like you are not making as much progress as you want to. But remember that everyone has to start somewhere. Everyone has to learn the basics before they can move on to more advanced techniques. Don't compare yourself to others. Compare yourself to yourself. Only you can determine your own strengths and weaknesses. Only you can set your own goals and measure your own progress. So don't get discouraged. Keep practicing and keep learning. The following quote is from a book called Zen in the Martial Arts by Joe Hyams. It reads, "When a student is ready, the master will appear." This means that when you have learned all that you can from your current teacher, it is time to find a new teacher. It is time to take your training to the next level. Don't be afraid to leave your old dojo and join a new one. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself by competing against better opponents. Don't be afraid to travel and learn from different teachers. Always be looking for ways to improve your skills and expand your knowledge. The world is full of great swordsmen and martial artists. Go out and find them. Challenge them and learn from them. That is the only way to become a true master yourself. When I was younger, I used to think that becoming a black belt was the ultimate goal of martial arts. I thought that once I achieved that, I would be a master and everyone would respect me. But I was wrong. Becoming a black belt is just the beginning. It is just a small step on the long journey of self-improvement. The real test of a martial artist is not how many belts he has or how strong he is. The real test of a martial artist is how he conducts himself in everyday life. The real test of a martial artist is how he treats others. No matter what style of martial arts you practice, whether it is karate, judo, kendo, Ido, or any other style, the principles are the same. Respect, discipline, and hard work. No one is born a master. Everyone has to start at the bottom and work their way up. So don't be afraid to start over. Don't be afraid to learn from the masters. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself. And most importantly, don't be afraid to fail. Failure is just another excuse to learn and improve. So get back up and start again. There is a Japanese proverb that goes, "Fall 7 times. Stand up 8. This means that no matter how many times you fall, as long as you get back up one more time than you fall, you will never be defeated. So never give up. Keep practicing and keep learning. The world is yours for the taking." Do you enjoy these videos? Check out our podcast where we discuss similar topics. Also, we would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this topic? Please leave a comment below. Thank you for watching. Train hard, good luck, and have fun. A master swordsman's work is never done. Even after years of training, a swordsman must continue to learn and grow. This is because the art of swordsmanship is constantly evolving. There is no such thing as a perfect sword technique. A swordsman must always be aware of his own weaknesses and strive to improve them. He must also be aware of the strengths of his opponents and find ways to exploit them. Musashi believed that a swordsman should never stop learning. He said that even the greatest swordsman in the world could be defeated by a beginner who was willing to learn from him. This is because the beginner had nothing to lose. He was not afraid to make mistakes and learn from them. The greatest swordsman in the world, on the other hand, was afraid to make mistakes. He was afraid of losing his title. Therefore, he could never improve his skills. If you want to be a master swordsman, you must never stop learning. You must always be open to new ideas and techniques. You must not be afraid to make mistakes. In fact, you should embrace them. Mistakes are the only way that we learn and grow. Therefore, never stop learning. Always seek to improve your skills. Only then will you become a true master swordsman. Swordsmen come from all walks of life. They are not limited to a certain class. Race organ there. Any person who has the desire to learn can become a swordsman. However, not everyone is cut out to be a swordsman. It takes a special kind of person to handle a sword. It takes courage, discipline, and mental fortitude. Not everyone can be a swordsman, but that does not mean that everyone should not learn the ways of the sword. Everyone should learn the basics of sword fighting. Everyone should learn how to defend themselves. We live in a dangerous world, and you never know when you might need to protect yourself or someone else. Knowing how to fight gives you the ability to protect yourself and others. It gives you confidence and self-esteem. You do not have to become a professional swordsman to reap the benefits of learning the ways of the sword. All you have to do is learn the basics. Learn how to hold a sword, how to strike, and how to defend yourself. With just a little bit of training, you'll be able to defend yourself against most attackers. So, don't let anyone tell you that you can't be a swordsman. Don't let anyone tell you that you are not strong enough or skilled enough. Prove them wrong. Show them what you are made of. Become the swordsman that you were born to be. It is common for a student to be the apprentice of a dojo for several years before being allowed to touch a real sword. During this time, the student will learn the basics of sword fighting and develop the necessary discipline and mental fortitude. Once a student is deemed ready by his teacher, he will be given the opportunity to compete in real sword fights. Real sword fights are much different than the choreographed bouts seen in movies and on television. There is no referee to stop the fight when one person is down. There is no honor code that dictates that fighters must stop when their opponent's sword is broken. In a real sword fight, the objective is to kill or incapacitate your opponent as quickly and efficiently as possible. A swordsman must be prepared both mentally and physically for a real sword fight. Mentally, a swordsman must be calm and focused. He must be able to think clearly and make quick decisions. Physically, a swordsman must be strong and agile. He must have the stamina to last the duration of the fight and the reflexes to react quickly to his opponent's moves. If you are a swordsman, you must train for real sword fights. This means sparring with other swordsmen, competing in sword fighting tournaments, and even participating in reenactments of historical battles. Only through this kind of training can you develop the skills and experience necessary to prevail in a real sword fight. Don't be afraid to get into real sword fights. Embrace the challenge and see it as an opportunity to test your skills. With proper training and preparation, you can prevail in any sword fight. Hello friends. Welcome back to history. In our last episode, we talked about how humans have been building ships for a really long time. We also talked about how people made money by trading things like incense and silk along those trade routes. But one thing that is very important to understand about all these ancient people is that they were doing this alone. They had help. In fact, entire communities were involved in making goods, building ships, and exploring new lands. This is Chapter 8, Teamwork and Division of Labor. Teamwork and division of labor are two phrases that sound like they could be used for an office party game or a self-help book or something. Instead, it's a super important concept when studying history. These two ideas describe how work gets done. By understanding them, we can better understand how all of the rest of human history will unfold. So let's break it down. Division of labor means exactly what it sounds like. It's splitting up work tasks so that everyone has their own job. Imagine if every single time you needed something fixed around the house, you had to call not only an electrician, a plumber, a carpenter, but also someone who specialized in fixing specifically your kind of lamp or your kind of sink or your kind of bookshelf. That would take forever. The division of labor means that there are people whose whole job it is to know how to fix bookshelves and sinks and lamps. They don't do it all, but they do those things much better than someone who tries to learn how to fix everything. And you might think, well, duh, that makes sense. But for most of human history, this wasn't the way things worked at all. Take, for example, the ancient Egyptians. They were famous for building massive pyramids and sphinx and temples. Do you want to be an architect? You could be an engineer. You could be a sculptor, a painter, an accountant, a bricklayer, a supervisor. Those are just some of the jobs that people did while building these huge monuments. Now that might sound like a lot of different jobs, that it was. But it still doesn't sound like that many compared to how many people it took to build something like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which took over 20. 0 workers are reported 20 years to complete. Each of those jobs was still pretty broad. It would be more accurate to say that each pyramid was built by thousands of teams of generalist workers who could do lots of different things. Many of them probably started out as farmers, and they came into the city to work on the pyramids during planting season. They might start out by carrying blocks, but eventually they could move up to more skilled tasks, like shaping stones, or even designing whole sections of the pyramid. Even though the work was divided up, there wasn't really any division of labor, because everyone was still pretty much doing the same thing. There was a clear hierarchy with architects at the top, and supervisors watching to make sure things stayed on track. But most people were considered pretty equal as far as their job went. Their work depended on other people doing their parts of the job. If the guy who was hauling blocks couldn't get enough blocks from the quarry, then the pyramid wouldn't go up as planned. Or if the engineers didn't have enough workers helping them, then the plans wouldn't get drawn up in time. Work was slow and depended on everyone working together. Fast forward a few thousand years, and look at the Chinese invention of paper. Paper might seem simple today, but before paper, writing was done on incredibly expensive and hard to make scrolls made from animal skins, or the thin inner bark of a mulberry tree. To make paper, rags, old pieces of fabric and recycled paper were ground up in water with a pestle and mortar. Then the mixture was spread on a screen to dry. The earliest paper makers were actually government workers who made paper for government use. But eventually, private paper makers started popping up. The tools required to make paper were expensive, so usually a paper maker would have 1 or 2 assistants, each with a specific job. One might operate the paper-making machine. One might process the raw materials. Another might make the screens. They still all did pretty much the same thing, but now there was a clear division of labor and the work got done faster. Okay, so that's division of labor. What about teamwork? Well, imagine you're standing in front of a massive ship, bigger than anything you've ever seen, with sails as tall as trees and rigging that reaches all the way to the sky. How did they build this thing? Well, it started with a team of carpenters who designed the ship, then caulkers who filled the gaps between, the planks rope makers to make the ropes and cables that hold everything together, sail weavers too, sew the huge sails, and metal workers to add the finishing touches. Building a ship was a massive undertaking that required hundreds of people with dozens of different skills. Most ships were built by people working together in a shipyard. These shipyards were often run by guilds, groups of workers who organized themselves and set the standards for things like quality and wages. Depending on the size of the civilization, shipyards could be small operations with only a handful of members, or huge businesses with thousands of workers. Now let's imagine that we're back in the same shipyard, but this time it's in ancient Greece, around 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Here, there are even more divisions. The ships being built here are big bulky cargo ships you'd find in China or Egypt. They're fast, nimble warships that the Greeks used to explore and conquer. The Greek shipyards were run by kings or the government. The biggest ships were reserved for the king's navy, and the best shipbuilders were employed by the king. The pay wasn't bad, and shipbuilders were respected members of society. But for most people, the division of labor in shipbuilding meant that they were stuck doing the same basic task over and over again. For example, many shipbuilders were slaves. Their job was simply to take the orders from the shipwrights and follow them without question. Under this strict hierarchy, there was little room for advancement. Slaves were also forbidden from learning to read and write, so they couldn't advance past the most basic tasks. Free non-slaves had a little more wiggle room. They were allowed to work as apprentices under master shipwrights and learn the trade. After several years, they might be able to open their own workshops and build ships independently, but only with the permission of the government. In fact, most of these free workers were also part of guilds, which meant that they followed strict rules about how to build ships. Guilds helped maintain the quality of goods and ensure that people paid fair prices for their work. But in order to protect their own interests, guild members kept secret the techniques and knowledge that they gained on the job. In effect, the guild leaders controlled who knew how to build ships, and therefore who could make money building ships. Eventually, guilds became so powerful that they could control not just how goods were made, but also who was allowed to buy and sell them. In Athens, the main political assembly was actually dominated by merchants belonging to wealthy merchant guilds. Together, they could influence laws to benefit their own trade and block new trade routes or foreign merchants from entering the city. Basically, these guys ran the place. So that's teamwork and division of labor. As civilizations grew larger and more complex, people began to specialize in smaller and smaller jobs, allowing them to do those jobs better and faster. At the same time, They also began working with more and more people who specialized in other jobs. Both of these trends continued and continue to this day. Today, we have people who design shoes, and people who tie the shoelaces on those shoes, and people who drive the trucks that deliver those shoes to stores. And although none of us may be doing every single step of the process, we all depend on all those different jobs being done so that we can get our shoes. In our next episode, we LLC. How teamwork and division of labor changed when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its official religion. Until then, remember, teamwork makes the dream work. And don't forget to subscribe. Bye. It's me. This is Chapter 9, Shipyards of Ancient Egypt. The Nile was the lifeline of Egypt. From its delta in the north to its source in the south, it was a highway of sorts. Ships were not only the main form of transportation, they were also floating temples and carriers of trade. The ancient Egyptians used two types of ships, papyrus boats and cedar ships. Papyrus boats were made from the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly in the shallow waters of the Nile Delta. They were small, flimsy things that could only carry about one person plus some cargo. But because they were so light and numerous, whole fleets of them were often seen on the river. Cedar ships, on the other hand, were huge vessels made from the resinous wood of Lebanon cedars. They were at least 3 times larger than today as typical cargo ship and could carry up to 400 tons of goods. These ships were not only used for trade, but also for warfare and royal processions. They were usually owned by the pharaoh or the Egyptian government and were manned by laborers who worked under the pharaoh's command. In this chapter, we will explore the shipyards of ancient Egypt, where these magnificent vessels were built. We will learn how the Egyptians designed and constructed their ships and what role they played in Egyptian society. So let's all get on board and sail back in time to the land of the pharaohs. Ancient Egypt is renowned for its magnificent ships. They were not merely means of transportation. They were floating palaces and symbols of the pharaoh's power. Now, these ships played a vital role in the Egyptian economy and were essential for trade along the Nile River and with other civilizations. To build these ships, the Egyptians had established large shipyards near the river where skilled craftsmen would design and construct various types of vessels, including papyrus boats and cedarwood ships. These shipyards were bustling centers of activity with workers using advanced techniques and tools to create ships that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. In fact, these ships were considered to be among the largest and most advanced of their time, with some measuring over 100 feet in length and 20 feet wide. They featured multiple decks, cabins, and storage areas, and were equipped with sails and rigging that allowed them to navigate the Nile efficiently. The construction of these ships required a significant amount of labor and resources and was often a collaborative effort involving teams of architects, engineers, carpenters, and other skilled workers. The materials used in shipbuilding were carefully selected and often imported from other regions, with cedarwood being a popular choice due to its durability and water resistance. Overall, the ancient Egyptian shipbuilding industry was an impressive feat of engineering and craftsmanship that played a vital role in the country's economy and cultural development. And now I'm going to tell you all about them. Alright, let's jump right into it. The ancient Egyptians kept busy when they weren't herding animals, cultivating crops, or building pyramids. They took up shipbuilding as a hobby. Unlike those flimsy papyrus boats that wealthy Egyptians used for leisurely rides on the Nile, true Egyptian ships were a sight to behold. They resembled today's cargo ships, only bigger and better. Imagine a vessel almost 3 times the size of a modern cargo ship, gliding through the water with ease. That was the kind of ship the ancient Egyptians were building, and they were doing it in shipyards near the Nile River. But how did these shipyards operate? Well, let me tell you. It was like an assembly line, but with more beer. The ancient Egyptians had it down to a science. First, they would start with the keel, which is the backbone of the ship. Then they would add the ribs and planks, and before you knew it, they had a ship. Of course, it wasn't that simple. It took dozens of laborers working with saws and chisels to create these massive ships. But hey, they had plenty of manpower, thanks to the slave labor system in ancient Egypt. Once the ship was built, it was time to decorate it with paintings and carvings of gods and mythical creatures. This part was probably the most fun for the laborers because they got to show off their artistic skills. Some ships were even equipped with masts and sails, allowing them to travel long distances on the Nile. The ancient Egyptians were proud of their ships, and rightfully so. They were not only impressive feats of engineering, but also symbols of the pharaoh's power and wealth. You see, the pharaohs were the ultimate ship enthusiasts. They loved nothing more than sailing around the Nile in their fancy ships, while sipping on some sweet fermented beer. Let's take a closer look at some of the famous ships of ancient Egypt. One of the most famous ships from ancient Egypt is the solar boat of King Khufu. This boat was discovered in 1954 by an Egyptian archaeologist named Mahmoud el-Damati during excavations at the Giza Plateau. The boat was found buried beneath the sand in a pit near the Great Pyramid of Giza and was originally thought to be a model for a larger vessel. However, further investigation revealed that the boat was actually intended to be used as a burial chamber for the pharaoh. The solar boat is made of cedar wood and is over 100 feet long, making it one of the largest ships ever built during the time period. The boat was designed to be pulled by oars and was decorated with paintings and carvings of the sun god Ra, whom the ancient Egyptians believed would help guide the pharaoh's soul through the underworld. The discovery of the solar boat provided valuable insights into the religious beliefs and burial practices of the ancient Egyptians. The boat was so well preserved that it was possible to identify the type of wood used in its construction and the techniques used by the shipbuilders. Today, the solar boat is displayed in a museum in Cairo, where it is one of the most popular exhibits. Another famous ship from ancient Egypt is the Lady of the East ship. This ship was discovered in 1937 by an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Borch. The boat was found in the ruins of the ancient city of Amarna, which was the capital of Egypt during the reign of King Ak. The Lady of the East ship is a papyrus boat made from reeds and papyrus plants that were common in the Nile Delta region. The boat was originally used as a funerary barge to transport the body of Queen Nefertiti from Amarna. The ship is notable for its unique design, which features a double hull and a pointed prow. It was also decorated with colorful paintings of the royal family and scenes from Egyptian mythology. The discovery of the Lady of the East ship provided valuable information about the art and culture of the Amarna period. The paintings on the ship are some of the finest examples of Egyptian art from this time period and offer insights into the royal court and religious beliefs of the era. Today, the Lady of the East ship is displayed in a museum in Cairo, where it is considered a masterpiece of Egyptian art and a symbol of the country's rich cultural heritage. Now, if you want to know more about how the Egyptians built their amazing ships, then check out this video. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. We'll see you there. Bye. Now, how would you like to build a boat? Easy. You find some logs, you stick them together, float your way across the Aegean or the Mediterranean. Now, if you want to be a little more fancy, you add sails. And if you really want to impress everyone around you, you build a warship with a ram and plenty of oars. But that's easy. Anyone can do it. But what about the Greeks and the Phoenicians? What about those shipbuilders who built ships that were not only fast and sturdy, but beautiful, too? What was their secret? What made these people so successful in ship? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. This is Crash Course, Building Ships, where we take a simplified, undemanding approach to understanding the world. So last time we left off with the Phoenicians coming into power in the eastern Mediterranean. They were a seafaring people who lived mostly on boats. Their ships were handy for trade and war, and they were generally pretty small and pretty slow. But while they were far from being the fastest ships around, they were hardy and reliable, traits that would serve them well during their travels. Around the same time, the Greeks were also starting to grow a taste for shipbuilding. At first, they focused on cargo ships, which had one innovation that made them stand out among other cargo ships: multiple decks. Since the Phoenicians and other Mediterranean sailors were usually carrying bulky goods, there wasn't much need for multiple decks. But the Greeks, they liked to haul wine and other luxury items, and that called for a different ship, one that could carry lots of weight but still move quickly. So the Greeks put 2 decks on their ships. That way they could pack twice as much on board. This gave Greek ships an advantage over Phoenician ships because they could carry more goods and they could make deliveries faster. It also helped that the Greeks had figured out a method of making ships faster by adding more oars. They took the basic design of the Phoenician galley and expanded it. Instead of having just a few long oars on each side, the Greeks doubled or even tripled the number of oars, though they were shorter than the Phoenician oars. This meant that although each oar was shorter, there were more rowers pulling at the same time, meaning that the Greek ships were faster. In fact, They were so fast that the Athenians commissioned a special class of ships known as a trireme, which featured 3 banks of oars on each side. That meant 180 rowers could pull on each side of the ship at once, making it incredibly quick. These ships were also narrow and low to the water, which meant that they were stable and maneuverable. In other words, the Greeks had invented the sports car of the ancient world, and they were so good that the Phoenicians looked over and said, "Hey, that's kinda cool." So they did what they always did when they saw something cool: steal it. Okay, maybe steal is too strong a word. Let's go with borrowed. So the Phoenicians started building their own triremes, and they were pretty good at it, though their ships were never quite as fast as the Greek triremes. See, speed isn't everything. While it's great to have a fast ship, you also needed to be able to carry a lot of weight, especially if you're planning to sail across the open ocean. And that's the thing about Greek triremes. Because they were so narrow and lightweight, they couldn't carry much besides the crew and their oars. They were great for duking it out in the Mediterranean, but not for long voyages. But the Phoenicians didn't just copy the trireme design. They added their own innovations, including a longer, wider hull that could carry more cargo. It's like when Mercedes and BMW see what the other company is doing and then try to top it. But in this case, it's more like when Mazda looks at Toyota and says, "That's pretty cool. How do I make it worse?" But then somehow it turns out that Mazda's version is better. For the Phoenicians, this process of borrowing designs and improving upon them was nothing new. They'd been doing it since before they were sailing the seas. Originally, the Phoenicians were a nomadic people who settled along the coast of modern Lebanon. They were surrounded by cultures that were much bigger than theirs, such as the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Israelites. So they learned to adapt to their neighbors' styles, whether they wanted to or not. For example, the Phoenicians were excellent crafters, creating jewelry, textiles, and metalwork. But when they traded with the Egyptians, they noticed that the Egyptians were better at it. So the Phoenicians borrowed their techniques and became masters of crafting themselves. They spread their newfound skills throughout the Mediterranean, and suddenly the whole region was full of shiny new stuff. And it wasn't just the Phoenicians. The Greeks did the same thing after they conquered Phoenician territory and took control of the purple trade. Now, they weren't exactly eager to learn from the Phoenicians, but they needed to keep the factories running if they wanted to keep getting rich. So they studied Phoenician crafts and then improved upon them. Pretty soon, Greek purple dye was taking over the Mediterranean, all thanks to studying their enemy. But how did this affect their ships? Well, by the time the Greeks and the Phoenicians were through with shipbuilding, they'd created some of the most famous ships in history. Take the Phoenician galley, for example. When the Phoenicians took the basic galley design and sped it up, they created a ship that was perfect for their needs. It was fast enough to chase down fleeing cities, carry enough supplies for long voyages, and was big enough to move entire armies. And it's all thanks to borrowing and improving. The Greeks also did the same thing. They started with a simple cargo ship and turned it into a luxurious, fast vessel. Then they copied the Phoenicians' rowing technique and combined it with their love of speed to create the mighty trireme. With its 180 rowers, it was the Ferrari of the ancient world. But these ships weren't just the result of engineering skill. They were also works of art. Both the Phoenicians and the Greeks loved beauty, and they found it in the sleek lines of a well-built ship. For the Greeks in particular, the quest for speed and symmetry led to some truly beautiful creations. The trireme was a marvel of Greek engineering, a perfectly symmetrical vessel with perfectly matched oars. It was so beautiful, in fact, that it became a symbol of Greek culture. The rows of oars were often painted red, contrasting sharply with the black hull, and the figurehead, the decorative carving at the front of the ship, was usually a mythical creature or a hero of Greek legend. These ships were so important to the Greeks that they even had a word for the feeling you got when you saw them. In English, that translates roughly to, "I am in awe." In fact, the Greek word for wondrous literally means, "worthy of thou amazing." The Greeks were so fond of their ships, they celebrated them in poetry and sculpture. One of the most famous Greek poets, Pindar, wrote many poems celebrating the victories of Greek sailors, and the sculptor Phidias created a statue of the goddess Athena that was over 100 feet tall, and placed it atop the Parthenon in Athens. The statue was so impressive that the Roman Emperor Caligula reportedly stood in front of it and said, "I would give half my kingdom to have that in Rome." And he wasn't talking about the statue of Athena. He was talking about the ship that was carrying it. You know, despite the beauty of these ships, building them was hard, sweaty work. Shipbuilding is tough, no matter what time period you're in. There are tons of pieces involved, each one of which has to fit perfectly. If you don't have the right tools, the job can be downright dangerous. There's also the issue of keeping track of all those pieces and making sure that you won't lose any. We've all seen those pictures of massive shipyards with thousands of parts lying around. Keeping track of all those pieces is difficult, even for computers. Back in the days of the Greeks and Phoenicians, it was nearly impossible. Luckily, they had accountants. Not the boring kind that we think of today, but real problem-solving mathematicians. You see, the Greeks and Phoenicians needed to keep track of numbers and quantities. They were traders, after all, and they needed to know how much they owed each other and how much money they made on each voyage. So they developed a system of accounting that relied on geometry. It was based on the properties of shapes, like the area of a triangle. By inscribing various shapes on tablets, they could represent numbers. This allowed them to keep track of their finances. Yes, but it also came in handy when they were building ships. See, when you're building a ship, you need to know exactly how much wood to order and how many rowers you need to hire. If you don't have the right amount of either, you're in trouble. Too little and your ship won't be big enough. Too much and you'll run out of money. When you need to measure something that doesn't have straight sides, you can't just use a ruler. You need something more complicated. Enter the Greeks and Phoenicians, who used a device called a dioptra to measure curved surfaces. It was basically a surveying tool that used the principles of geometry to calculate the area of irregular shapes. With these tools, shipbuilders could measure the hull of their ships to make sure they had the right amount of wood. It also helped them to calculate the amount of sailcloth they would need to cover the masts. These tools weren't just used in shipbuilding, of course. They were used in accounting, engineering, and surveying. In fact, they were so useful that they helped the Greeks become one of the most powerful navies in the ancient world. But that's going to have to wait until next time. Many cultures throughout history have had innovations that changed the course of human history. Innovations like the printing press, the steam engine, and, well, you get the idea. But few innovations have had as lasting an impact as the alphabet. The alphabet makes writing easier than ever. You can write anything you want with just 26 letters. That's why we're using it to tell you all about our sponsor, today's video. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course, Building Ships, which was filmed at a studio and made in partnership with a digital studio in nature. You want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever? You can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. The Romans were masters of engineering on land. But what about when they took their engineering to sea? Welcome to my channel. It's time for Chapter 11. Roman Engineering at Sea. Massive naval fleets had never before been built so quickly. Yet, that's exactly what was required when Rome went to war with Carthage. The Roman Republic would build massive fleets of ships for the first time ever, all in less than a century. During the Second Punic War, Rome assembled a fleet of nearly 200 ships in just 6 months. And by the time the war with Carthage was finished, Rome had become the dominant naval power in the Western Mediterranean. So how did they do it? Let's find out. This is a small village on the coast of central Italy. Archaeologists had discovered the remains of a small shipyard here, complete with dry docks and the tools used for making ships. But this shipyard wasn't from ancient Rome. It was from the 7th century BCE. And this is how shipwrights likely built ships for the Atreides. The Romans didn't invent shipbuilding. They learned how to make ships from the Atreides. The process began by selecting the right tree. The best trees were the Aleppo pine and the white oak. These trees grew along river banks and were close to the coast, which made them easy to access. Ancient forests weren't like today's forests. Trees were always being harvested and replanted because ancient people understood that harvesting too many trees in one area would eventually lead to erosion. In fact, there's evidence that the Romans planted over 400 million trees during the empire, mostly along the coast. Shipbuilding required large areas free of trees, so shipwrights would often request clearings from local governors who controlled the forests. But once a suitable tree was found, cutting it down was no easy task. Ancient trees were massive and incredibly strong. A single tree could require up to 30 men to cut down. After the tree was cut down, the trunk was then trimmed and shaped into a rough hull. Iron tools allowed shipbuilders to work faster and more efficiently. but saws still took hours to cut through the thick planks of wood. Once the hull was shaped, the tree trunks were hollowed out by burning the inside of the log and scraping away the charred wood. This process made the center of the boat thicker than the ends. This was intentional to ensure the sturdiest part of the ship. The middle was also its thickest part. The next step was shaping the planks that would cover the hull. To create the planks, the logs were placed vertically and cut using an axe. Once the planks were created, they were smoothed with a file. Each plank was numbered to ensure they went back to their correct spot during assembly. After all the planks were ready, it was time to assemble the ship. First, the bottom of the hull was attached to the keel, or backbone, of the ship. Next, the sides of the ship were attached. This was done using long wooden pins, called triremes. These nails were soaked in vinegar for several weeks prior to installation to help the wood expand and contract around them. The final step was attaching the top planks of the hull. Rope was used to hold everything together until the final assembly was complete. Then the rope was removed and the tree nails were hammered into place. The completed hull was then dragged to the water and fitted with masts, sails, and oars. For the Romans, these ships were primarily warships, but regardless of what ship they were using, the Romans appreciated efficiency. That's why they would use standardized parts whenever possible. A good example of this was the Roman galley, the most common warship used by the Roman Navy. But let's talk about innovation. One innovation that set the Romans apart from other shipbuilders of the day was the way they fastened the planks to the frame of the ship. Instead of running the nails horizontally, like the Greeks did, the Romans ran the nails diagonally. This method was stronger and more secure, but it also made the ships much faster. Another innovation was the introduction of the corvus, a boarding bridge that extended from the ship to the enemy vessel. The bridge allowed Roman soldiers to quickly board enemy ships without having to swim the last few feet. The corvus was a decisive factor in Roman naval victories, but not everyone appreciated these innovations. During the Social War, Rome was fighting against the Italian tribes north of their city. Rome's allies were losing badly at sea to Rome's enemies. In response, Rome sent some of their best engineers to secretly copy the enemy ships. What they found was shocking. Their allies had actually been building better ships, using better techniques than Rome. This was a wake-up call for Rome and inspired them to take their shipbuilding and engineering more seriously. This led to the creation of new types of ships, including larger cargo ships and vessels that could carry more soldiers. One such vessel was the Liburna, a type of transport ship that could carry 2 legions across the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, innovation didn't always come easily. One of the most important resources for any shipbuilder is a good dock, where ships can be constructed and repaired. Most of the major powers of the ancient world built their ships along natural harbors. This gave them a significant advantage over other builders because a harbor meant the ships wouldn't have to fight against the waves while being built. But Rome wasn't as lucky. Rome was built on the Tiber River, but the river had no natural harbor. In the early days, the Romans simply built their ships downstream at the port of Ostia. However, as Rome grew, so did the demand for ships. Soon this wasn't enough. They needed a better solution. The answer came when the Emperor Caligula decided to build a new harbor. It might seem odd to build a harbor on the river that runs through your city. After all, a river naturally erodes over time, changing the course of the river. But this wasn't a typical harbor. Instead of being built along the shoreline, this harbor was built in the middle of the river. It was essentially a long pier, extending into the Tiber with a basin at the end. The basin was connected to the shore by another pier, creating a sheltered area where ships could safely be built. Construction began in 33 AD and took 4 years to complete. But this project wasn't without its setbacks. Halfway through construction, one of the long piers collapsed, sinking 1,000 soldiers and sailors to their deaths. Regardless, the project continued until its completion in 37 AD, unfortunately. The new docks didn't fix all of Rome's problems. By the time of Augustus, Rome had become the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. Now they needed somewhere to put all those ships. The solution was to build the largest artificial harbor in the ancient world. But it wasn't easy. Rome's population had grown to over 1 million people by the time of Augustus. They needed somewhere to put all those people plus the growing number of ships. The answer was the port of Misenum. Misenum was located at the base of the Alban Hills south of Rome. The location was perfect. It was protected from the wind and far enough away from Rome that the noise of the port would unannoy the citizens. But the terrain presented quite a challenge. The hills dropped straight into the sea, leaving very little room for a harbor. So the engineers built a series of floating docks to create a sheltered area for ships to dock. Over time, the port grew and expanded. There was even a lighthouse built at the entrance of the harbor. But the most impressive feat of engineering at Mesopotamia was the aqueduct that brought fresh water to the port. Water had to be brought in because there was no natural source of fresh water in the area. But instead of using existing roads, the engineers built a special road just for the aqueduct. This ensured the aqueduct wouldn't be disrupted if the road had to be repaired. By the time the port was finished, it covered over 600 acres of land. The port of Misenum made it easier for Rome to defend their empire, but it also brought Rome closer to the sea. Citizens could now enjoy the benefits of the sea without having to travel to distant ports. So what was life like at the Roman port? Imagine walking down a crowded street, dodging pedestrians and vendors. All around you are the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, children playing and the distant sound of the sea. You're in the port of In the distance, you see an aqueduct bringing fresh water into the port. Nearby, you pass a group of sailors unloading crates of exotic goods from a transport ship. The crates are stamped with the emblem of the eagle. Beneath the eagle, you can read the name of the ship, the Ghana. You turn the corner and find yourself in front of a large warehouse. The building has been freshly painted and is adorned with murals depicting scenes of Roman naval victories. On the side of the building is a sign indicating it S4, the use of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the commander of the Imperial Navy. As you walk further into the port, you begin to hear the sounds of hammers and saws. Shipwrights are repairing a damaged vessel, patching up the hull and replacing damaged masts. In the distance, you see the stern of a warship, its bowsprit pointed towards the sky. The ship is preparing for battle. On board the ship, a group of soldiers are readying their weapons, their armor glinting in the sunlight. The soldiers board the ship using a ramp, each step secured with a rope handrail. As the soldiers climb the ramp, you notice the intricate carvings along the side of the ship, a testament to the skill of the shipbuilder. Suddenly, a shout goes up from the docks. A merchant has just arrived from the east with silks and spices. You turn to see a procession of men carrying goods towards a waiting merchant ship. The merchants unload the goods using a crane. The crane's hook swings towards the ship, lifting the goods to the waiting sailors. As the sun begins to set, you see the silhouette of a fishing boat returning to port. The boat is laden with the day's catch, fresh fish that will soon be sold in the marketplace. The fishing boat docks alongside a row of merchant vessels, their colorful sails a stark contrast against the darkening sky. Life at the port is busy, bustling with activity. From the merchants, to the sailors, to the shipwrights, everyone is working hard. But there is also time for celebration. The Roman port is a hub of activity, a place where the goods of the empire are traded and where the soldiers of the navy prepare for battle. It's a place where the sea meets the city, where the waves of the Mediterranean crash against the shore and the people of Rome come to trade, to fight, and to live. Okay, so that does it for Chapter 11. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. I really hope you enjoyed the video. And if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time. This is the story of Jack London in the Jungle Book. Our story begins in the dark and dangerous world of woodworking, where men like 20-year-old protagonist Will Blake are exposed to some of the greatest hazards imaginable. For starters, there's splintered wood which can easily penetrate flesh and cause serious infections. Then there are crushed limbs, either from the weight of the massive logs or from being caught in the machinery. And if that wasn't enough, there are burns from the fire-bending planks. These are just some of the many dangers that these men face every day. But it's not just their physical safety that's at risk. In fact, even their minds can be broken by the constant exposure to such trauma. But what really makes this job so hazardous is the lack of protection. Unlike other professions, the men in this industry are not provided with any safety gear. They have to rely on their own wits and strength to get the job done. And if they make one wrong move, well, then they'll be paying for it with their lives. In a moment, we will continue the tale of young Will Blake and see how he copes with all these dangers. But first, let us take a look at some of the most common workplace accidents that can occur in woodworking. One of the most common accidents that can happen to a woodworker is getting hit by a falling object. This can be anything from a small piece of wood to a large plank or even a whole log. It doesn't matter how big or small the object is, though. What matters is that it falls on someone's head and causes serious injury or even death. It's hard to believe, but every year people are killed or maimed simply because they were UN paying attention and did UN see the object coming. Another common accident is getting caught in a machine. This can happen while feeding wood into a saw or while trying to clear a jam. If a person gets caught, they could be pulled into the machine and have their hand or arm torn off. In some cases, the machine may even throw the limb back, which can cause further injury. You might think that getting caught in a machine would only happen to someone who is inexperienced or careless, but that's not necessarily true. Even the most experienced woodworkers have lost limbs due to accidents like this, so it's important to always be aware of the potential danger and to take the necessary precautions. Now let's talk about burns. This can happen in a number of ways, such as touching a hot saw blade or getting too close to a fire when bending wood. Burns can also occur from steam, which may not seem like much of a hazard. But trust me, steam burns are no joke. They can happen when opening a steamer or removing wood from a press. The steam that builds up inside can be very hot and has been known to cause severe burns. Even breathing in too much steam can lead to coughing and difficulty breathing, so it's important to be aware of the potential danger and take precautions accordingly. Finally, let's discuss the often overlooked hazard of sawdust. Breathing in large amounts of sawdust can lead to a condition called asthma, which makes it difficult to breathe. This can be especially dangerous for those who already have breathing problems. Sawdust is also a fire hazard as it can easily ignite and cause a fire or explosion. Fires are dangerous in general, but they are especially problematic in woodworking because of the large quantities of flammable materials present. A fire can quickly spread through a woodworking shop, causing extensive damage and posing a serious risk to the lives of those inside. Even after considering all these dangers, many men still choose to work in woodworking. Maybe it's because they love working with their hands, creating something beautiful out of raw materials. Or maybe it's because they enjoy the challenge of working with such dangerous tools. Whatever the reason, there's no denying that woodworking is one of the most hazardous jobs out there. Will Blake was born and raised in a small village and had always loved woodworking. His father was a master craftsman and had taught Will everything he knew about the trade. When Will was old enough, he began working in his father's shop and learned how to use all sorts of saws, planes, and chisels. He was quick to learn and soon became an expert woodworker himself. As word of his skills spread, Will began getting requests from all over the country, and eventually he decided to strike out on his own. He opened his own woodworking shop and began taking on bigger and more challenging projects. One day, Will was working on a particularly challenging project when disaster struck. A fire broke out in his shop and everything he had worked for went up in flames. Devastated but determined, Will rebuilt his shop and vowed that it would be even better than before. He worked tirelessly and soon had another successful business going. But tragedy struck again when a customer came into his shop and was seriously injured by one of his machines. Despite the danger, Will continued to work. He knew that he was talented and skilled and felt confident that he could handle anything that came his way. But deep down, he couldn't help but worry about the possibility of another accident. For a while, nothing happened, and Will began to feel like maybe he was right. Maybe he was talented and skilled enough to handle anything. But then one day it happened again. Will was working on a new project when he was suddenly hit by a falling plank of wood. He was taken to the hospital, where it was discovered that he had suffered a serious head injury. Thankfully, he survived the accident, but he was never the same again. The accident had damaged his brain, and he began suffering from seizures and other neurological problems. Will's story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of woodworking. No matter how talented or experienced you are, accidents can and do happen. All it takes is one moment of carelessness or one malfunctioning machine to cause serious injury or even death. Working in woodworking can be incredibly hazardous, but some people are drawn to the trade anyway. Maybe it's because they love working with their hands and creating tangible objects out of wood. Or maybe it's because they enjoy the challenge of working with such dangerous tools. Whatever the reason, it's important to remember that woodworking is one of the most hazardous jobs out there. So what can we do to stay safe? Well, for starters, we need to be aware of the dangers involved. We also need to take precautions and never work with dangerous tools or machinery without proper training or supervision. Finally, we need to be prepared for accidents by having a first aid kit on hand and knowing how to use it. If you're thinking about getting into woodworking, please take these warnings to heart. It's a beautiful trade, but it's also a dangerous one. Take all the necessary precautions to stay safe, and you might just find that you have a passion for woodworking as well. Well, Blake's mind raced as he considered the possibility that his time had finally come. The massive log that had been pinned against his chest was slowly but surely crushing the air out of his lungs. With each passing second, his vision blurred and his heart pounded in his chest as if trying to escape the impending doom. Suddenly, the log shifted slightly and a surge of hope coursed through Will's body. Was it possible? Could he survive this? After what seemed like an eternity, the log finally rolled away and Will found himself gasping for breath. His body battered and bruised, but miraculously alive. The accident had taken place while Will was working on a new project, an intricate wooden sculpture that was proving to be quite challenging. As he maneuvered the heavy log into position, he had misjudged its weight, and it had shifted, pinning him against the workbench. Will had struggled against the weight, desperately trying to free himself. But the more he struggled, the more the log shifted, pressing against his chest and stealing his breath. Just when he thought he couldn't take another second of the crushing pressure, the log moved, giving him a small window of opportunity. Will had managed to free himself from certain death, but the ordeal had shaken him to his core. He looked at the sculpture, once his masterpiece in progress, now merely a jumble of wood and twisted metal. In that moment, Will realized that his life was hanging in the balance. Would fate allow him to keep living, or had his time come to an end? Now, Will was no stranger to the dangers of his craft. As a seasoned woodworker, he understood the risks that came with working with heavy logs and sharp tools. But this experience had been different, more terrifying than any accident he'd had before. It was a stark reminder of the fine line between life and death, a line that he'd crossed many times before, but never so narrowly. The memory of his late father flashed before his eyes. A man who'd also loved woodworking with all his heart, but who'd paid the ultimate price for his passion. Will's father had been killed in a freak accident years ago when a falling branch had crushed him while he was working on a project. Will had been just a boy at the time, but the memory of his father's smiling face and the smell of sawdust still lingered in his mind. That's why Will had chosen to follow in his father's footsteps, embracing the trade of woodworking despite the inherent dangers. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of his latest project, Will began to question his choices. Was it worth risking his life for his art? He looked around at the tools that had become both his livelihood and his tormentors. The saws and chisels that had yielded beautiful creations in the past now seemed like menacing weapons poised to strike him down. Will closed his eyes, trying to steady his trembling hands. The accident had not only shaken him physically, but emotionally as well. The sudden jolt of terror, the feeling of his life slipping away, all of it had left an indelible mark on his psyche. As he stood there, Will realized that he could not go on like this. Consumed by fear and uncertainty, he had two choices ahead of him. The first was to succumb to the fear, to let the accident break him and abandon the craft that had been his passion since childhood. The second path, fraught with danger, was to confront his fear head-on, to push through the pain and the trauma and return to the thing he loved the most, woodworking. Will's gaze fell on the unfinished sculpture, a testament to his skill and his audacity. It represented not only the accident he had survived, but also the countless other challenges he had faced in his career. He remembered the hours he had spent hunched over his workbench, the precise movements of his tools, the satisfaction of seeing a rough block of wood transform into a work of art. Woodworking was more than just a trade for Will. It was an expression of his creativity, a way of making sense of the world around him. With a deep breath, Will pushed away the lingering fear and picked up a chisel. The familiar feel of the tool in his hand brought a sense of comfort and focus. He examined the wood before him, seeing not just a lifeless block of material, but a potential masterpiece waiting to be born. The accident had been a traumatic experience, but it had not broken him. He would continue to honor his father's memory by embracing the trade they both loved, by pushing through the pain and creating beauty out of wood. And so will Blake, the woodworker, return to his craft, forever marked by the accident, yet undeterred in his passion. As the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows over his workshop, Will worked with renewed determination. The accident had shaken him to his core, but it had not extinguished his passion for woodworking. With each stroke of his chisel, he carved out not just a design, but a new chapter in his life. The pain in his chest slowly faded, replaced by the rhythmic thud of his hammer and the whir of his saw. Will was determined to turn his pain into creation, to honor his father's memory by continuing the trade that had connected them. As the days turned into weeks, Will's masterpiece began to take shape. The pain in his chest gradually subsided, replaced by a sense of purpose and healing. Each stroke of his chisel, each cut of his saw brought him closer to completing his work and to reclaiming his life from the clutches of fear. Looking at the finished sculpture, Will felt a surge of pride and accomplishment. It was more than just a work of art. It was a symbol of his resilience, his triumph over adversity. The accident had been a defining moment in his life, but it had not defeated him. Instead, it had made him stronger, more determined, and more appreciative of the gift he had in woodworking. Will's story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can guide us through. It's a tribute to the human spirit's ability to heal, to adapt, and to overcome. As Will continues his work as a woodworker, he carries with him the lessons learned from his ordeal, forever grateful for the second chance he's been given. This is Chapter 13 of The Secret History of Ships, narrated by an old salt. Now, we've been having so much fun on this voyage through naval history. It's time to acknowledge that many people still follow maritime traditions born in the distant past, whether they realize it or not, when sailing out into the ocean. These sailors are engaging with the same spirits their ancestors did more than 1,000 years ago. Some of these customs are simply superstitions. Others seem downright crazy, but they all have one thing in common. They were all developed to keep the ship and crew safe from harm. Let's get into it. Chapter 13, Rituals, Superstitions, and Beliefs. Before we begin, please make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. We're about to go deep into some obscure stuff that most people don't know about. And if you learn something new here, please tell someone else. We all love sharing the joy of discovery. That said, let's get into it. The world's oceans have claimed countless ships and untold lives. Sailors have always felt vulnerable at sea, and for centuries, they believed that evil spirits could influence the fates of ships and fishermen. In an effort to avoid disaster, they created rituals, superstitions, and beliefs to appease these spirits and ensure their safety. These range from prayers to sacrifices, and even some rather bizarre practices. One of the most widespread maritime traditions is the blessing of timber before cutting. This custom dates back to the days of the Vikings, who held great reverence for the natural world and believed that trees had souls. Before a tree was felled, they would often perform a ritual to honor its spirit and ask for its protection. For example, they might make an offering of food or drink to the tree or ask the tree as permission before cutting it down. Similar traditions can still be found today among some logging communities, where workers may hold a ceremony before cutting down a particularly large or old tree. In modern times, shipbuilders may not necessarily believe in the supernatural, but they often continue to perform this ritual out of respect for the tradition and as a way of honoring the ship they are building. For example, when the keel of a boat is being laid, some shipyards will place offerings inside the keel for a protection on the long journey ahead. These offerings can vary depending on the culture and beliefs of the builders, but they might include things like coins, small statues of protective figures, or even personal belongings such as a lock of hair or a piece of clothing. The keel is the backbone of the ship and is considered to be the most important part of its structure. By placing offerings inside the keel, shipbuilders show respect for the vessel and those who will sail it. They hope that the spirits will look over the ship and crew and keep them safe from harm. Some shipbuilders also carry on an ancient tradition of making votive offerings to the sea itself. This can take the form of small ceremonies where objects such as flowers, candles, or even small boats are released into the water with prayers or wishes for good luck and safe travels. But there are other, more unusual customs that are still observed in some parts of the world. One of these is the practice of throwing a bottle of rum overboard to calm the seas during a storm. This is based on the belief that the rum will appease the spirits of the ocean and prevent them from causing further damage to the ship and crew. While there is no historical evidence to support this claim, it is a tradition that has been passed down through generations of sailors. Similarly, some sailors still carry a small bottle of holy water on board as a way of protecting themselves from evil spirits or bad luck. This practice is rooted in the Christian tradition of using holy water to bless and consecrate objects and places. There are also many superstitions that sailors follow to ensure their safety and well-being. For example, it is considered bad luck to whistle on a ship because it is believed to summon the devil. Likewise, it is also bad luck to open an umbrella below deck, because it is seen as a symbol of death. Other superstitions have to do with the behavior of animals on board. For example, if a black cat jumps off a ship, it is believed to be an omen of bad luck, so sailors will often try to prevent cats from leaving the ship. And then there are the strange and mysterious beliefs that surround the figure of the Old Man of the Sea. This legendary creature is said to inhabit the oceans around Great Britain and Ireland, and it is believed to have the power to control the weather and cause shipwrecks. To avoid the wrath of the Old Man of the Sea, sailors would make offerings of flour and water before setting sail, and they would also take precautions such as avoiding sailing on Fridays or keeping cats on board to ward off evil spirits. While these beliefs and superstitions may seem strange or even absurd to some, they serve an important purpose. They provide a sense of comfort and security to those who believe in them, especially in the face of the unknown and unpredictable nature of life at sea. Many sailors hold these beliefs close to their hearts, and they pass them down to younger generations, ensuring that the traditions and superstitions of the sea continue to be observed for many years to come. Some maritime traditions are much more complex than others. One of the most elaborate is the naming of a ship. In many cultures, the name of a ship is believed to have a powerful influence on its fate. For example, in Chinese culture, the name of a ship must be chosen carefully to avoid any negative connotations or meanings. This is because the Chinese characters used to write the name can have multiple meanings, and it is important to avoid any that could bring bad luck, such as the character for death or suffering. Similarly, in Japanese culture, the name of a ship is often chosen to reflect its intended purpose or the values that it represents. For example, a passenger ship might be given a name that evokes feelings of luxury and comfort, while a cargo ship might be given a name that emphasizes its strength and reliability. These traditions are not only observed in Asian cultures. However, in many Western cultures, it is also believed that the name of a ship can influence its fate. For example, in some maritime traditions, it is considered lucky to name a ship after a famous seafarer or a mythical sea creature. On the other hand, it is also believed that certain names can bring bad luck, such as the name Mary, which is associated with the Virgin Mary, who was said to have wept when she heard that her son Jesus was lost at sea. Because of this, some sailors avoid naming their ships Mary or any of its variations, such as Miriam or Maria. It should be noted that these beliefs are not necessarily based on any factual evidence. Rather, they are part of the folklore and traditions of different cultures that have been passed down through generations of sailors. Nevertheless, these beliefs are deeply ingrained in maritime culture and continue to be observed by many sailors today. When choosing a name for their ship, whether it be for a new boat or even just a nickname for an old one, many sailors will take these beliefs into account. Next, we need to talk about ship figureheads, which is another maritime tradition that has both practical and symbolic significance. Traditionally, the figurehead was a carved wooden statue that was mounted at the front of a ship's bowsprit. It was not only a decorative element that added beauty to the ship's design, but also served as a symbol of the ship's identity and purpose. The choice of figurehead could vary depending on the ship's nationality, intended use, and even the personal preferences of its owner. For example, many British ships in the 18th century featured figureheads of female mermaids, which symbolized the ship's grace and agility. Meanwhile, American ships often had figureheads of Native American women, which reflected the colonial era's fascination with indigenous cultures. Beyond their symbolic meaning, figureheads also had a practical function. They were believed to have the ability to ward off evil spirits or bad luck by placing a protective figure at the front of the ship. Sailors hoped to avoid storms, shipwrecks, and other misfortunes. Some figureheads were even said to have magical powers, such as the ability to calm the seas or bring good fortune to those on board. While figureheads are no longer commonly used on modern ships, the tradition continues in some forms. Many sailing ships and racing boats still feature decorative wooden or fiberglass figures at the front of their bows, although these are typically more stylized and less detailed than the traditional ship figureheads of the past. Nevertheless, they serve the same purpose as their ancestors, adding a touch of beauty and symbolism to these vessels, while also providing a sense of identity, and perhaps even a bit of good luck. Now we need to discuss the spiritual weight carried by shipbuilders, which is an interesting topic that delves into the beliefs and cultural norms surrounding the role of shipbuilder. In many cultures throughout history, the act of building a ship has been seen as a sacred and transformative process. that imbues the shipbuilder with special powers and responsibilities. For example, in ancient Greece, shipbuilders were often considered to be intermediaries between the human and divine realms. They were believed to possess the skills and knowledge to harness the power of the gods and create vessels that could be used for important religious ceremonies or journeys to the afterlife. The shipbuilders were so respected in Greek society that they were even granted their own special festival, the Shipbuilders' Panathenea, where they were honored with processions, sacrifices, and competitions for the best ship. Similarly, in many indigenous cultures around the world, shipbuilders are traditionally men who have undergone a vision, quest, or other spiritual initiation, rites that give them the knowledge and abilities to construct boats for their community. These boats are not just means of transportation, but are often seen as sacred vessels that can carry the souls of the dead or be used in rituals to communicate with the spirit world. Even in modern times, the role of shipbuilder carries a certain amount of cultural weight. In some shipbuilding communities, there are traditions and customs that are meant to honor the shipbuilders and the important work they do. For example, some shipyards have their own rituals for launching new ships, such as breaking a bottle of champagne across the bow or having a special coin minted to commemorate the occasion. Whether these beliefs are based on actual supernatural powers or simply a reflection of the importance placed on shipbuilding in different cultures, they all share a common theme. Shipbuilders are not just craftsmen, but are individuals who have a special connection to the spiritual realm and the powers that be on high. That's going to do it for this episode of The Secret History of Ships. Please leave a like and a comment and tell someone else about this channel. Your support helps us grow and allows us to explore more maritime topics. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world around you. We'll see you then. The long and exhaustive process is almost over. There are only a few things left to do before the big show. In this episode of The Launch, we will see the last-minute preparations. Then finally, we will see the ship touch the water for the first time. Will it float? Will it sink? Let's find out. This is a story about a ship. More specifically, it's about the launching ceremony of the ship. But before we can get to that exciting moment, we must go through some pretty boring parts of the process. It is almost like a ritual in which you have to participate before you can get to the good stuff. We are now at the point in the process where they are putting the finishing touches on the ship before it gets launched. This is a very slow process that takes a lot of time. And since this is a big ship, there are lots of little details that need to be taken care of. So it's going to take a while yet. The good news is that all the major systems have been installed and tested. They've installed the engines and tested them. They've installed the rudders and tested them. They've even installed the propeller and tested that too. And it's not just the ship that they're testing. They also test everything that goes into the ship, including lifeboats, life rafts, life buoys, life rings, flares, fire pumps, fire hoses, and so on. In fact, they test everything on the ship except for the cargo holds. You don't want to waste time loading cargo just to test a ship. Instead, they filled the cargo holds with ballast water. That way, they can still test the ship's stability without having to load any cargo. Of course, while all this is going on, they also have to finish building the outside of the ship. For example, they still have to install the masts and booms. And then once all that's done, they will start painting the hull. And when I say painting, I don't mean just 1 or 2 coats of paint. No, they apply several coats of paint, and each coat needs to dry before they can apply the next coat. So that adds several more days to the process. Fortunately, in this case, they don't need to paint the hull, so they can skip that step. But either way, it's a very boring process that takes a lot of time, and you probably don't want to watch it. So let's just fast forward and get to the more interesting parts. After all the preparations are done, the entire community gathers at the shipyard to witness the launching ceremony. People come from all over the world to see this event. Some of them are there to support the shipbuilders. Others just want to see a massive ship being launched for the first time. As the clock ticks down to 0, everyone is on edge. Some people are nervous, and others are excited. When the ship starts moving, everyone cheers and takes pictures. Finally, the ship touches the water and everyone holds their breath. Will it float or will it sink? Fortunately, the ship floats. Everyone lets out a sigh of relief. Once the ship is in the water, they start towing it away from the shipyard. This is also an exciting moment because no one knows what will happen. Will the ship stay afloat, or will it capsize? Once again, fortunately, nothing bad happens and the ship reaches the open sea without any problems. But now it's time for the most important test of all, the open sea trials. That will truly show if the ship is seaworthy or not. At this point, the ship is still under construction. Many things are still being worked on and tested. It's a bit dangerous to be on board at this point, but someone has to do it. The ship sets sail for its open sea trials. On board are a group of brave souls who will test the ship's seaworthiness. They sail through rough seas and strong winds. They test the ship's stability and strength. After days at sea, the ship returns to port. The crew disembarks, and the ship is docked. The open sea trials are over, and the ship is passed with flying colors. Now, it's time for the final touches. The ship is towed back to the shipyard, where the finishing touches are being put on. They complete the work that was started before the launch. They paint the hull, install the funnels, and complete the interior. Before they know it, the ship is ready for its maiden voyage. On the day of the maiden voyage, everyone is excited. The ship is finally ready to set sail for its new home. As the passengers board the ship, they can't wait to start their journey. The captain gives the order to set sail and the ship begins its journey. The passengers cheer as the ship leaves the port. The first few days of the voyage are uneventful. The ship sails smoothly through calm seas. The passengers relax and enjoy the ride. But then the weather takes a turn for the worse. Storms brew and the seas become rough. The ship battles the elements as it makes its way to its destination. But the ship is strong and it manages to withstand the storm. Finally, the ship reaches its destination. The passengers disembark and the ship is docked. The voyage is over. As the people of the town gather to welcome the ship, they are proud to see such a magnificent vessel in their midst. They know that the ship will bring prosperity to their town. The ship is a symbol of hope and a reminder that anything is possible. I had to tell this story because it's a common mistake that many people make. They think that ships are built to be launched, and then they are tested. The truth is that ships are built and tested at the same time. The entire process of building a ship is a test in itself. If the ship is not strong enough, it will not survive the launch. If the ship is not stable enough, it will capsize during the open sea trials. What do you think? Do you think the ship will float or sink? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe for more updates. It's hard to believe, but after all these months of work, it's finally time to launch the ship. Everyone is here. The shipbuilders, the engineers, the investors, and even some government officials. They're all here to see the culmination of all their hard work. The ship is rolled out to the launch pad and it's time to release the clamps. This is the moment of truth. Will it float or will it sink? There's only one way to find out. The next step is to detach the launch sled. This is a tricky operation, but the crew is experienced and they know what to do. They detach the launch sled and the ship is on its own. Now it's time to tow the ship to the open sea. This is another test to see if the ship is seaworthy. The crew maneuvers the ship out of the harbor and into the open sea. They test the ship's steering and handling. The next step is to conduct the open sea trials. This is the ultimate test to see if the ship is seaworthy. The crew takes the ship out into the open sea and tests it against the elements. They test the ship's stability, strength, speed, and maneuverability. After all the tests are completed, the ship is deemed seaworthy and it's time to celebrate. The crew and the shipbuilders celebrate their success. They have built and launched a ship that can withstand the toughest of seas. It is a great feeling to be part of a team that has built something that can conquer the seas. It's a feeling of accomplishment, pride, and satisfaction. It's the feeling of knowing that you have created something that didn't exist before. Building a ship is more than just a job. It's a passion. It's a way of life. It's a tradition that has been passed down for generations. And I'm proud to be a part of that tradition. Every ship is different. Every ship presents its own unique challenges and rewards. But one thing is common: the feeling of accomplishment that comes with building a ship. It's a feeling that you can't get from any other job. It's a feeling that makes you proud to be a shipbuilder. So, here's to all the shipbuilders out there. May you continue to build ships that can conquer the seas. May you continue to pass down the tradition of shipbuilding to future generations. And may you continue to feel the pride and accomplishment that comes with building a ship. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. In the last chapter, we talked about the most famous ancient ships, but they don't get remembered for nothing. They are only remembered because some exceptional circumstances made them stand out from all the other ships. But there were also millions of ordinary ships that played an important role in the rise and fall of civilizations. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the people who built them and left a legacy that shaped the world. Welcome to my channel, where I bring you new episodes every week about ancient ships and shipwrecks. The stories of the men and women who built ships have been largely forgotten, with very few exceptions. And yet without these nameless individuals, many of the empires we look back at today would not have reached the heights that they did. It was their sweat that spread goods, ideas, and culture throughout the known world. It was their sweat that enabled wars to be fought and won or lost. It was their sweat that allowed explorers to reach distant shores and return with riches beyond imagination. Yet their names have been lost to time. We know little about their lives, how they died or what they believed in. We do know that they worked in brutal conditions for long hours without pay or recognition. They weren't slaves, but they rarely had any rights either. They lived in a world where life was cheap and death by drowning or hanging was always around the corner. But still, they built magnificent ships that sailed into the sunset and became legends. Let's start in Greece. The first Greek ships date back to the 20th century BC, when Mycenaean shipbuilders constructed light cargo ships and fast warships to serve the expanding interests of their empire. Very quickly, shipbuilding became one of the most important industries in the Mediterranean, supplying the raw materials and manpower for some of the greatest navies the world has ever seen. But who were these shipbuilders? What was their life like? What skills did they possess? And what kind of ships did they make? Archaeological evidence suggests that the Greeks began building ships as soon as they started trading along the coast. By 1600 BCE, they were already constructing large vessels capable of carrying up to 50 tons of cargo across the Aegean Sea. This is remarkable, considering that the average size of a modern container ship is over 1,000 times greater than that. The oldest surviving piece of ancient Greek literature that mentions ships is the epic cycle, a series of poems written between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. Unfortunately, none of the original texts have survived. However, the works were compiled by a writer named Nonnus in the 4th century CE. According to Nonnus, the first ships were built by the god Poseidon after the Argonauts completed their quest for the Golden Fleece. He commanded the Dryads, tree spirits, to become the ship's oarsmen, and the stern was adorned with a golden fleece. The prow of the ship was immortalized with a sculpture of Athena, who encouraged the sailors with their presence. These mythical origins reflect the importance of shipbuilding in Greek society. Ships were seen as a gift from the gods themselves, allowing humans to explore the world and conquer the seas. The process of building a ship was believed to have been invented by the Phoenicians, legendary seafarers who lived in what is now Lebanon. However, the Greeks took this knowledge and improved upon it, creating more durable and efficient vessels that could travel further distances. According to Homer, ships were made by craftsmen who had learned the secrets of shipbuilding from prisoners taken during the Trojan War. He wrote that they built two types of ships, the round-sided transport vessels for merchant traffic and the fast, narrow-sided war galleys, propelled by banks of oars. Unlike today, there was no standardized way of building ships. Each ship was built differently based on the skill of its builder. The tools used in shipbuilding were simple, just hammers, chisels, saws, and nails made of bronze. Wood was fastened together using dovetails, which are interlocking joints that required great skill to cut accurately. Bronze nails were then driven through the joints to hold everything together. This method of construction required a highly skilled workforce that was well versed in the properties of wood and the use of tools. The best shipbuilders were highly sought after, and their services were in high demand. Shipbuilding was not considered a respectable occupation for free men in Greece, and the majority of the labor was done by slaves captured in wars. Shipyards were located close to forests and harbors to be close to their main resources, wood and water. While the exact locations of the yards are unknown, we can assume they were close to Athens, Argolida, and the Hellespont. The biggest expense in building a ship was the wood. The preferred wood was cedar from Lebanon, pine from the Black Sea coast and Cyprus, and fir and spruce from the northern Aegean islands. Many of these trees had to be imported from other countries, and the cost of importing lumber could account for a significant portion of the overall cost of building a ship. Large ships required a lot of wood, and a single galley could require up to 3,000 talents of cedar. The price of a ship varied depending on its size and purpose, but a small merchant vessel could cost as little as 50 talents, while a warship could cost several thousand talents. This was a huge investment, and shipbuilders were often employed by wealthy merchants or the government. Ancient Greek ships played a critical role in the development of seafaring and trade throughout the Mediterranean. From the small fishing boats used by local fishermen to the massive warships that dominated the seas during the age of Pericles, each ship represented a significant investment and a testament to the skill and ingenuity of the shipbuilders who created them. As we continue to explore the history of ancient Greek shipping, we'll see how these ships helped shape the course of history and enabled the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture across the Mediterranean. So stay tuned to learn more about the incredible ships that once ruled the waves. Moving to India, shipbuilders there mastered the art of boat building using bamboo. Bamboo is a versatile and durable material that is well suited for boat building due to its strength, flexibility, and water resistance. Indian shipbuilders were among the first to use bamboo to construct boats that were not only efficient and durable, but also elegant and beautiful. One of the most famous examples of Indian bamboo shipbuilding is the dhow, a type of boat that has been used for centuries for both transportation and warfare. The dhow was typically made from a single large log of bamboo that was hollowed out and then divided into compartments. The compartments were then sealed with a mixture of cloth and resin, and the boat was finished with a coat of paint. This type of boat was highly maneuverable and could carry a significant amount of cargo or a crew of soldiers. The builders would select straight, sturdy bamboo stalks and then cut them to the desired length. They would then use a combination of sharp tools and fire to hollow out the interior of the stalks. Once the stalks had been hollowed out, they would be sealed together using a combination of rope and a sticky substance known as mud. The finished boat would be coated in a layer of paint made from natural materials, such as tree bark. Indian bamboo shipbuilding played a significant role in the maritime trade networks of the ancient world. The boats were used to transport valuable goods such as spices, cotton, and silk along the coastlines and across the Arabian Sea. During the time of the ancient Egyptians, Indian ships were known for their speed and agility, which made them ideal for warfare. They were often used by the navy of the Chola dynasty to patrol the coast and defend against pirates. We'll end this episode with a thought. The next time you see a big cruise ship or a military aircraft carrier, take a moment to remember the nameless men and women who built it. Their lives were hard and dangerous, and they rarely received any credit for their work. But without them, none of us would be able to travel the world or wage war on distant shores. So let's raise a glass to the shipbuilders, the unsung heroes of history. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider supporting the channel. With that, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.